Hello fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're walking home through frozen streets, lying beneath a heavy blanket waiting for sleep, or just filling the quiet while the sky turns grey, this space is yours. Because tonight, we're descending into one of the coldest truths in our ancestry, how early humans endured the Ice Age without fire. This is deep time storytelling for the quietly curious. It's an untold struggle, a 700,000-year frostbitten silence, when fire was not yet mastered and the cold was not yet kind. But it's not the simple tale of discovery you might expect. No sparks, no Prometheus, just flesh and wind and the long ache of waiting for warmth that never came. Oh, and if you're the sort of human who finds calm in long-form science, look just below the video. You'll see a button that says subscribe. If you tap it and the bell next to it, you'll get notified when new stories arrive. You can unsubscribe any time. That tiny click is what keeps this channel going. Without it, we genuinely can't make more. Also, where are you right now? What time is it for you as you listen to this? If you feel like sharing, tell us in the comments. It's a quiet reminder that we are not alone. And if your eyes begin to close, let them. Timestamps are in the description. Now, we begin with a wind that could not be tamed. There was a time, long before the mastery of flame, when the cold itself was a kind of predator. It crept into bone, slipped under skins stitched with sinew, and turned sleep into risk. This is a story not of invention, but of endurance, of how early humans survived in climates so frigid, so merciless, that even fire, when it existed, could not be relied upon to stay. They entered this frozen world without torches, without hearths, without the certainty of warmth, and for hundreds of thousands of years they lived on the edge of the possible. Not because they had conquered nature, but because they hadn't. Not yet. The cold came first. The fire would come later. And so we begin in that in-between, nearly 1 million years ago, when bands of Homo erectus, tall and clever and relentless, stepped across a quiet boundary they could not name. From the warmer woodlands of southern Eurasia, they moved northward, beyond the latitudes where night comes sooner and snow no longer melts by morning. They crossed into regions shaped by the long rhythm of ice and thaw, where winters stretched into months and trees thinned into open steppe. Why would they go? Was it hunger, hope, or accident? Did they follow the hoofprints of migrating herds too far north, only to find themselves stranded when the season shifted? Or was the lure of new land stronger than their memory of warmth? They did not know the word glaciation, but the Earth did. In cycles spanning tens of thousands of years, massive ice sheets rolled and retreated across the northern continents, reshaping rivers, sculpting valleys, and altering ecosystems in slow, grinding pulses. Climate did not just chill the air, it rewrote the map of the world, and there, scattered across these transforming landscapes, came the fireless humans, tool users, meat-eaters, endurance hunters, walking upright beneath grey, cloud-heavy skies. What did it mean to survive such a place without flame? To rise before dawn with frost in your nostrils and no ember to nurse? To watch your breath bloom into fog while your hands, wrapped in whatever hide could be scavenged, cracked with cold? Archaeologists find the bones and flakes they left behind, flint tools chipped with skill, animal carcasses butchered with precision. But what they rarely find, at least in these earliest northern sites, is ash. No hearths, no circles of scorched earth, no carbon-stained stones where fire once flickered. The layers remain silent, empty of heat. Can the absence of a thing be as telling as its presence? When we sift through these ancient campsites and find no charcoal, no blackened bone, what story is being whispered? Not one of ignorance, perhaps, but of a different rhythm. One where fire, if it came at all, came from the sky or from the trees struck by lightning. A brief gift, a passing glow, a miracle they could not yet recreate. How did they cope when the wind howled and the snow fell and there was no flame to gather around? And if fire was not yet theirs to keep, what was? They kept moving. They followed rivers that did not freeze solid and tracked animals whose warmth came not from shelter, but from motion. In this vast, pale world, where glaciers loomed like sleeping titans in the north, and winds carried knives instead of songs, Survival depended on the body, the group, and the land itself. The cold pressed in from every direction, but they answered not with fire, but with flesh, with will, with the slow, deliberate act of staying alive. Homo erectus, and later Homo heidelbergensis, did not turn back. They pressed deeper into the mystery of the north, into lands that had no name and no promise. What drove them still? Some urge beyond reason, a restlessness encoded in bone, a willingness to wager the body against the unknown. And the further they went, the more the world asked of them. They encountered not the lush forests of their origins, but open steppes swept bare by wind. Trees grew sparsely here, and what wood there was often remained green or frozen, unfit for ignition. In winter, snow would crust the ground in silence, and even the rivers would still encased in shimmering layers of ice. No dry branches, no smouldering logs, no fire to hold. The very ingredients of flame were missing, as if the earth itself had decided to withhold that secret just a little longer. What happens to the body in such a world, when no fire waits to thaw stiff limbs or dry soaked hides? Shivering is the first defence, a reflex that burns energy to generate warmth, but it is temporary, it cannot last the night, and so they wrapped themselves in the skins of the very creatures they hunted. Reindeer, aurochs, horse, not trophies, but necessary armour. Clothing was not sewn yet. That invention would come much later, but hides were likely tied, layered, perhaps chewed to soften, then bound to shoulders and thighs. It was not enough. But it helped. Still, nothing could match the heat of fire. Without it, there was no flame to sterilize water, no embers to dry meat, no blaze to signal others across the plains. Without it, each human was alone with the dark, fending off not only the cold, but the feeling that warmth itself might be a myth. How many fingers were lost to frost? How many nights ended in silence because one spark could not be caught? We do not know their names, but we carry their questions, and if warmth could not be summoned from the earth, then perhaps it could be found in one another. Huddling skin to skin, the group became the hearth. The body became the fire. Mothers pressed infants against their chests. Hunters likely slept back to back in windbreaks made of bone and hide. In the absence of flame, the only warmth was shared, fragile, fleeting, and fiercely guarded. Is that how we became human? Not through tools alone, not through language, but through the quiet act of enduring each night without fire, together, through the necessity of care, of vigilance, of closeness. In a world where every cold breath threatened to be the last, survival was not an individual conquest. It was a shared ritual, repeated under grey skies and starlit silence, in hollows dug from frozen earth or among stone outcrops that dulled the screaming wind. Perhaps our ancestors did not yet know flame, but they were learning something else, interdependence. And still, the cold never relented. It did not pity, it did not blink. It was not a villain to be vanquished, only a force to be weathered, indifferent, unfeeling, absolute. The archaeological record preserves this indifference. Sites like Happisburgh in England and Dmanisi in Georgia, both remarkably ancient, show hominin presence in latitudes far from equatorial comfort. They show footprints, stone flakes, butchered bones, but no hearths, no char, no remains of deliberate combustion. These people did not stumble into the cold. They stayed. They returned. They lived. What kind of memory lives in hands that never learned to make flame, but still struck flint to break bone? What kind of mind maps a migration route not through warmth, but through absence? Valleys where the cold cuts less deeply, ridgelines where wind can be blocked by rock. If there was no fire to gather around, then orientation came from the stars, the land, and the beasts they followed. Fire could be lost, but the earth remained. And so they adapted not by transforming the world with heat, but by submitting to it with strategy. Their tools grew more refined. Hand axes were shaped with symmetry and care, some as large as a forearm, others finely pointed for precision. Not weapons of conquest, but instruments of negotiation, with animals, with hunger, with time itself. Flint became their reply to the cold, not in flame, but in edge. A sharp stone could skin a hide, scrape fat from bone, open marrow. Fire could have cooked, but in its absence they sliced, and the animals they hunted. Many of them were large, thick-skinned and cold-adapted themselves. Reindeer, wild horses, woolly rhinoceroses. They too had evolved to survive without flame, their bodies insulated by dense fur and layers of fat. To hunt them was to tap into a reservoir of warmth. Temporary, yes, but vital. A freshly killed carcass meant calories, heat, tools, and wrapping. It meant one more night. Is that what the first fires meant when they finally came? Not just light or heat, but relief from improvisation, from risk, from the daily brutal calculus of exposure. Because before there was mastery, there was only management. And before fire became a tool, it was a hope, glimpsed in the trees struck by lightning, in the smouldering remains of a burned field. There, and then gone. How many times did they try to hold it, and fail? A branch stolen from a lightning fire, carried carefully, too carefully, until the wind took it. Embers buried in ash, tended with hope through the night, only to awaken to cold stone and the terrible quiet of extinguishment. Perhaps there were moments when the flame stayed, for an hour, a day, and then flickered out in a storm or with a wrong breath, or the simple absence of dry kindling. And in those moments, what was lost was not just heat, but belief. The sense that maybe this time would be different, that maybe this time they had finally found a way to hold the sun, because they knew what fire could do. They had seen it. They had felt it. Even if they could not yet summon it at will, they must have returned to the scorched sites of wildfires, scavenging warmth from trees still smouldering, gathering torches from charred branches. Fire was not unknown, it was untamed. A phenomenon that arrived like weather, unpredictable, potent, vanishing. Its flickering light danced on cave walls before language, its warmth called them close before myth was born, and yet, for hundreds of thousands of years, it remained elusive, a phantom of survival, a question with no answer. The bones in the earth keep their secrets. At sites like Bilsingsleben and Boxgrove, where Homo heidelbergensis lived and worked, archaeologists find tools, butchered animal remains, even traces of wooden spears, but no fire pits, no layered ash, no carbon shadows pressed into soil. Some interpret this as evidence of preservation bias, the fragile traces of early hearths lost to time. But others wonder, what if the absence is real? What if the silence in the soil is not a failure of the record, but a portrait of a world where fire simply did not yet stay? And if so, then what kind of mind emerged in that world? A mind that survived not through domination, but through exquisite sensitivity, to temperature, to wind direction, to the habits of prey. A mind that learned to read the landscape like a scroll written in scent and slope and shadow. Before they controlled fire, perhaps they learned to move like smoke, invisible, adaptive, finding warmth not in place, but in motion. To live without fire in such a place is not just to endure, but to anticipate, to know when to migrate before the frost hardens, to recognize the warning calls of birds before a blizzard, to sense, perhaps even subconsciously, which way the wind turns before it carries death. Is this not a kind of intelligence, not technological but embodied? Not about the making of tools, but the making of decisions? In the end, the fireless cold may have sculpted more than bones and habits. It may have sculpted awareness. And when the first true hearths were finally made, when fire no longer came from chance but from choice, what shifted was not just the world, but the story humans told about their place within it. Could the cold have been our first teacher? Not a gentle one, not a teacher of language or song, but a force that shaped the curriculum of survival. It taught through removal, of comfort, of certainty, of warmth. And in that void, early humans became something more than instinct. They became intentional, not because they had fire in their hands, but because they were learning to live without it. And this is where the mystery deepens, because fire is everywhere in the human story, in myth, in ritual, in every telling of what separates us from the beasts. But for most of our time on this earth, we did not control it. We desired it. We feared it. We borrowed it. But we did not make it. Not yet. The earliest unambiguous hearths, enduring, habitual, built and rebuilt in the same place, do not appear in the archaeological record until around 300,000 years ago. That means for perhaps 700,000 years, cold-adapted humans lived in hostile climates with no reliable flame. So what filled the silence? What grew in that waiting space between the first footprint in the snow and the first spark struck from stone? Perhaps it was patience. Perhaps it was the slow stitching together of strategy, of cooperation, of planning that stretched beyond the day. The cold demanded foresight. It punished hesitation. It sculpted a brain that could imagine not just where the herd would move next, but what would happen if the fire went out. Even now, we can see the evidence, not just in fossils or flints, but in ourselves, in our reflexes tuned for vigilance, in our skin still sensitive to sudden chill, in our memories, which cling more tightly to dark winters than to warm summers. We are the descendants of those who did not burn, who did not boil their water, who did not sleep by firelight. We carry still the resilience of the fireless. And so, when we picture those early ancestors walking through the frost-bitten valleys of Pleistocene Europe, or the wind-whipped steppes of Central Asia, we must not see them as unfinished or primitive. They were not waiting for fire. They were surviving without it. They were sculpting a life in its absence, a life of cold meat, of silent nights, of bundled hides and shared breath. What did it mean then, when the first true hearth finally held? When fire no longer came and went like a storm but stayed, banked, fed, carried forward, it meant the end of a long exile from warmth. It meant the closing of a chapter written in frost and silence. But that chapter mattered. It was the crucible in which something else was forged, not fire but the capacity to live without it. And that may be the oldest human story of all, not the story of what we mastered, but of what we endured, not of how we lit the flame, but how long we kept walking in the dark before it finally stayed. It is not merely a poetic question. It is a physiological crisis, a nightly reckoning. In the Ice Age world, the sun did not always return quickly. Winter nights could stretch for 16 hours or more. Wrapped in a silence so total that the only sound was the slow creaking of trees under frost. Sleep was no refuge, it was a risk. For the early humans who lived without reliable fire, nightfall marked the beginning of a test, of the body, of the mind, and of the bond between those huddled close in the dark. The threat was not metaphorical. Hypothermia begins subtly. Shivering turns to sluggishness. Coordination falters. The mind grows fogged. Eventually warmth feels like it is returning. A cruel illusion known as paradoxical undressing, where the cold tricks the brain into believing heat has returned. By that time, death is near. And in a world without flame, that spiral could begin just a few degrees below freezing. So how did they sleep? Did they sleep? Or did they learn to sleep in shifts, trading vigilance for rest? Curling close like wolves beneath a fallen hide? In the absence of fire, warmth had to be manufactured from biology and ingenuity. The human body generates heat constantly, but in freezing conditions it bleeds out in minutes unless shielded. And so, the early humans turned to what they had: animal skins, natural shelters, each other. A carcass might be skinned and its hide thrown directly across the shoulders. Bones might be stacked into a crude windbreak, the gaps stuffed with moss or hair. Caves, when available, offered some protection, but they were not always safe or dry. Often the only shelter was what they could build with their hands before darkness fell. In this way, sleep became a ritual of improvisation. Pelts were wrapped, not tailored. Straw or grass might be piled beneath the body to prevent direct contact with the frozen ground. Children likely nestled into the crooks of adults, stealing heat with small silent breaths. The group became an organism, coiled inward, still and listening, its only fire the warmth shared between ribs and shoulders. But the cold was not the only danger. There were eyes in the dark, lions with ice in their manes, hyenas adapted to cold climates, wolves that did not bark, only stalked. Without fire, there was no light to keep them back, no blaze to signal territory. To sleep was to surrender to night's uncertainty. What rustled at the edge of the clearing? What passed, unseen, beyond the ridgeline? Who was on watch? And were they still awake? And if the fire could not be kept, if there was no glow to cast boundaries between self and shadow, then what was night except a kind of slow vanishing? What was sleep except a rehearsal for death? And yet, somehow, they did sleep. They had to. The human brain cannot go long without surrendering to unconsciousness, even in peril. But perhaps sleep in those days was not what we know now, not the soft drifting into dreams beneath artificial warmth, but a shallower kind of surrender, light and fractured, punctuated by shivers and the creak of branches. Perhaps it came in fragments. Perhaps it came only when the body had no more to give, and not a moment sooner. Was there ever true rest, in a world where darkness meant exposure, and silence meant danger? Imagine lying on frozen soil, the stars distant and sharp above you, your breath rising like smoke into the endless black. There is no hearth, no embers, only your own chest, rising and falling, keeping its slow, defiant rhythm against the cold. Around you, others sleep or pretend to. One stirs, another pulls their hide tighter around their knees. No one speaks. Language, if it came at all, came later. But the fear, that was fluent. This is where the mind begins to change. Because when fire is absent, the night is not just cold, it is infinite. Without flame, there is no visible edge to the world, no warm perimeter to define here from there. Darkness folds in from every direction, dissolving the borders of the body, the group, even the self. In such nights, vision is useless. The ears take over. The skin becomes an antenna. Every crunch of frost, every breath of wind. Every shift of fur against fur is felt as omen. And the dreams? If they came, they must have been shaped by this tension, by the body's battle to keep breathing, by the mind's attempt to make sense of the formless dark. Were these the first myths, the first stories, not spoken but dreamt? Images flickering behind the eyes of a cold sleeper, half hungry, half frozen, imagining warmth as memory or prophecy? Still, there were ways to fight back. They built niches in cliffsides, crouched behind fallen boulders, layered grasses beneath their sleeping places. In some sites, archaeologists have found circles of large stones, not fire pits, but perhaps sleeping rings, places where individuals gathered tightly, using the stones to cut wind and define space. It was not warmth, but it was boundary. And in the Ice Age world, boundary meant survival. They used what they could. Large animal hides draped across simple frames or weighted at the edges with stone could trap enough heat to keep the air inside slightly warmer than the air outside, slightly. Enough perhaps to delay the drift into hypothermia, and when no structure was possible, they relied on each other. The human back is warm, the chest is warmer. Layered together, they made a slow burning furnace of bodies and breath. What kind of trust does that require, to sleep with your spine pressed to another's in the dark, knowing that without them you will not wake? It is a trust not spoken, but built in silence, in breath patterns aligned by survival, in the instinctive curl of bodies around the most vulnerable among them. Infants pressed against their mother's belly, children cradled between elders. The young formed the core of this living structure, shielded by heat and hierarchy, watched by the tired eyes of those who dared to stay awake. Perhaps a father shifted every hour. Perhaps a sister never truly slept. Perhaps each night was a rotation of blinking and listening, a choreography of the half-awake. What emerges in such conditions is not just a strategy, it is culture, or its beginnings. The shaping of behaviour through experience, repetition and emotional memory. The fireless night sculpted not just the body, but the bonds between bodies. It was not enough to endure individually. Endurance had to be mutual. The warmth of another became sacred, their breath, an inheritance. The line between kin and stranger blurred under hides because cold does not ask for lineage. It asks for proximity. But the body, however clever, has its limits. In deep cold, skin freezes in minutes. Fatigue steals coordination. Hands numb before they can tie knots. And in this fragile equilibrium, sleep becomes a question of timing. Too early, and you risk freezing. Too late, and you collapse. So they adapted, not in skin or bone alone, but in ritual. Lying down was not casual, it was prepared. Ground cleared, shelter secured, eyes on the sky. Even the act of closing one's eyes required calculation. And all the while the cold was listening. We know now that hypothermia is not just a drop in temperature. It is a physiological unravelling, a slow severing of the mind from the body. Thoughts grow vague, memory slips, words fail, then the heart begins to slow. To sleep in such a state is to gamble against the end, and yet they did. For thousands of years, they curled into themselves and each other, wrapped in hide and darkness, and tried to dream. What dreams are born from such a world? When the last light is gone and the sky offers no comfort, does the mind retreat inward, conjuring warmth from memory? Do faces appear, those who were lost in the cold before, or those who never made it through the night? Perhaps that is when morning began, not in graves, but in dreams, in the realization after waking that a body beside you no longer breathed, that the warmth you shared had slipped away quietly in the hours before dawn. Without fire, how did they mark death? How did they distinguish sleep from its shadow? In the long dark, the difference could be measured only by warmth, by touch, and if the body beside you turned cold, then the night had taken one more. And morning, when it came, was not a promise, only proof that you had survived again. But what kind of mind awakens to that knowledge again and again over generations? Not with celebration, but with a wary exhale. Another night endured, another tally added. In a world where fire was a wish more than a tool, dawn was not an awakening, it was a reprieve. And so they stood slowly, joints stiff, breath steaming from cracked lips, eyes squinting against low winter sun that gave little warmth but just enough light to move. They moved not out of confidence but necessity. The cold had not gone, it had only shifted its shape. Where once it pressed down in darkness, now it waited in the wind, in snowdrifts, in the glaze of frost that covered every surface, even their tools. Stone held the night's chill long after the sky grew pale, and fingers were not yet ready to wield it. Movement itself became medicine, the only reliable way to rekindle inner heat. And this was the rhythm. Nightfall was risk, morning was recovery, and in between was the thin thread of improvisation that held life together. No fires meant no drying of wet hides, no warming of frozen marrow, no boiling of snow to drink. And so each mistake compounded. A misjudged camp, a collapsed shelter, a lost animal skin, and the night became harder. In this way, the fireless ice age was not a static hardship, but an escalating one. Every moment tested memory, foresight, and invention. Yet out of that crucible came something else, sensitivity. Awareness honed not by comfort, but by discomfort. These early humans, survivors of nights without end, developed a kind of intuition not born of speech or schooling, but of accumulated sensation. They could smell a coming frost, hear the change in animal movement before a storm, feel the quality of air shift as temperatures dropped, their skin acting as a barometer. It was not mysticism, it was adaptation, carved over centuries of cold. And as the cold shaped the body and the instincts, it also carved into emotion. What does it mean to be afraid of the dark, when the dark is not metaphor but material, when it takes, silently and without mercy? Fear itself became a form of knowledge, not weakness, but signal. If someone feared a camp's placement, or the thinness of a shelter's hide, that fear could save lives. This too was passed down. Not through words, perhaps, but through gestures, caution, glances exchanged at dusk when the wind began to rise. Emotional memory became as critical as tool memory. Without flame, there was no distraction, no flicker to stare into, no story shared around light. Night was not ritual, it was ordeal. And in that ordeal, generation after generation learned the shape of vigilance, of what it meant to love in the cold, to protect in the dark, to endure without glow. How many of those quiet lessons etched in frost still whisper in us today? The flinch at an unexpected cold draught, the unease in pitch-black rooms, the instinct to gather, to nestle close beneath shared blankets, to check that doors are shut tight before sleep. These are not quirks, they are echoes. Ancient reflexes carved into nervous systems that were once shaped by a world where nightfall was never safe, and the cold was never kind. And still, the fire would not come. Not reliably, not yet. In the archaeological layers of these early Ice Age camps, we find tools, we find bones, we find footprints pressed into clay long hardened by time. But what we do not find, again and again, are hearths. No layers of ash, no scorched stone circles, no blackened soil that speaks of flames nurtured and contained. For hundreds of thousands of years, the fireless night was not an exception, it was the rule. and in its absence, humans grew quiet, watchful. They learned to see without seeing, to wait without sleeping, to endure not just the cold of the body but the weight of psychological darkness. Because when there is no fire, there is no centre, no place to face, no glow to define the group's geometry. Everyone becomes the edge. And in that edgeness, a new kind of awareness is born, spatial, social, and spiritual. Perhaps this is where the circle was first imagined, not as symbol, but as instinct. The configuration of bodies forming a fragile perimeter against a world that offered no warmth but each other. And what of the soul? Did they know it yet? Or did it emerge one night when someone did not wake and the group had no fire to burn the body, only the choice to leave it in the snow or carry it through the cold? Was that the moment the human heart first felt the ache of memory, not just grief, but the recognition that absence has a shape? We imagine the future as light, but we come from darkness. For most of our story, the flame was not with us, and yet we survived. Not through mastery, but through proximity, through vigilance, through the softness of a hand reaching out in the dark to find another. In a world without fire, the body became the lantern, the group became the hearth, and sleep, that most vulnerable surrender, became an act of trust, a nightly wager against a world still unlit. So when we light our modern fires, in houses, in camps, in screens that glow against the void, we are not just banishing the cold, we are remembering it. We are honouring a lineage of sleep stolen in fragments, of nights counted in breaths, of humans who lay in the frost and dared to close their eyes anyway. And somewhere, deep within us, a part still listens, to make sure the fire hasn't gone out. Infancy is, by design, a fragile gamble. Newborn humans arrive into the world with no fur, no fat reserves, no ability to shiver effectively, and no instinct to crawl toward warmth. Their survival depends entirely on others, and in the Ice Age, where the ground itself could steal body heat in moments and the air sliced like glass, this vulnerability became a question of lineage, of whether a family or a species could continue. An infant left unguarded for minutes in that world would not merely cry, they would fade. Unlike the mammals they hunted, whose offspring arrived in spring with thick coats and sturdy limbs, early humans bore children who required months, even years, of full-body care. The cost of our upright posture and enlarged brains was a narrow birth canal and premature delivery. Our infants arrived unfinished. They had to. And this meant that their first environments were not landscapes, but flesh, wrapped in arms, pressed to breasts, swaddled against the same skin that had carried them. But skin, without fire, was not always enough. The physics of heat loss is ruthless. A small body loses heat far faster than a large one, especially when the air is dry, still, and cold. In the absence of flame, warmth had to come from the human furnace, from mothers, fathers, siblings, all curled into shelter like living embers. We speak often of carrying in anthropology, of how upright walking freed the arms, of how infants were slung across hips. But carrying was not only about mobility, it was about insulation, it was about survival through contact. And when night fell, and temperatures dropped below freezing, and the wind began to whistle through the cracks in hide and stone, what then? Infants could not speak, but they could fall silent. They could become still. And in a world with no warning systems, no thermometers, no central fire to gather around, silence in a child was not peace. It was danger. How many mothers in that age pressed their ears against the tiny chest of a sleeping baby, unsure if it was sleep at all? How many fathers offered their own cloak, thin, frozen, but still a barrier, to keep a child's breath from turning to mist in the cold? The archaeological record does not preserve these moments. It holds no footprints of the newborn, no fossilized cries, but sometimes beneath layers of stone we find the tiniest bones. Burials, deliberate and careful. A child laid on antler, a bead placed beside a skull the size of a fist. And from these sparse clues, one question rises again and again. What happens to hope when the warmth it needs is not yet in your hands? In those fireless winters, hope was not a word. It was a gesture, a mother tightening the wrap of hide around her child's body, a father shielding an infant with his own back against the wind, a sibling cupping a newborn's head in the hollow of their arm as they lay inside the circle of the living. There were no lullabies yet, no carved cradles, but there was swaddling, there was holding, there was the slow transmission of heat from chest to chest, hour after hour through the long dark. Anthropologists often speak of altricial species, animals born helpless, dependent, shaped for care. Humans are among the most altricial of all mammals, and in the Ice Age, this helplessness was magnified 100-fold. Without fire, nothing came easy. Swaddling was not decorative. It was defence. Grasses were dried in the sun and bundled around the infant's limbs. Soft furs were folded into slings, carried against bare skin. Even the smallest gap, a shoulder exposed, a toe uncovered, could invite the cold inside, and once it entered, it was hard to expel. So the body became architecture. The mother's torso, a furnace, her arms, shelter walls, her breath, a slow exhale against the child's face, keeping air from freezing in tiny lungs. During travel, infants were bound to the back or belly, not just to be moved, but to stay alive in motion. Heat loss from wind chill could be fatal, but movement brought blood flow, and where the adult body remained warm, the infant could survive. In these moments, the line between nurture and infrastructure dissolved. Shelter was not something built, it was something embodied. The tribe did not merely protect the infant, it became the infant's weather system, its climate, its fire. And fire still would not come. There are sites across Europe and Asia where we find the traces of these people, Homo erectus and later Homo heidelbergensis. Stone tools, animal bones, shelter depressions. But in layer after layer, fire remains elusive. Charcoal is sparse, hearths are rare or absent. If flame was known at all, it was borrowed from nature. Lightning strikes, smouldering branches, perhaps the remains of a tree set alight by dry wind. But even then it flickered, it failed, it could not be summoned, and when it failed, it took more than heat. It took the future. Because to lose warmth in that world was to risk not only the present body, but the next generation. Infant death is not just tragedy, it is a bottleneck. One child lost is a lifetime of possibilities erased. One failure to keep warm is 1,000 names never spoken, 100 tools never made, 12 journeys never taken. And yet, they kept trying. There is a kind of love that exists before language, not declared, but enacted. In a fireless world, that love looked like this: a mother waking every hour to reposition a hide, a father keeping watch with frozen feet, a baby wrapped tight, pressed between bodies in the dark, breathing, still breathing. That small detail, the continuation of breath, was everything. It was the unspoken heartbeat of the group. Every exhale from a swaddled chest became a measure of success, a quiet defiance against the landscape's indifference. In this way, the infant became not a burden, but a centre. The fire had not yet come, but the child was already a kind of flame, tiny, flickering, fragile, but vital. And so the village, the band, the scattered shelter of hides and branches revolved around that breath. Because caring for the young was not the work of one body alone. Among modern hunter-gatherers, and likely among our ancestors, a pattern emerges: cooperative breeding. Mothers do not raise children in isolation. Grandmothers contribute. Older siblings share tasks. Aunts and uncles, whether by blood or bond, help carry, help feed, help shield. This strategy, unusual among mammals, is deeply human, and in the absence of fire it may have been the only way forward. One body alone could not remain warm enough through the night, but 5, 7, a tangle of limbs and hides, strategically layered and repositioned through the cold hours, that could work. The infant was passed not out of detachment, but necessity. A mother needed sleep to nurse, a father needed time to hunt, a sister, still young herself, learned care through imitation, and the child, nestled among different chests and breathing different rhythms, became fluent in many kinds of comfort. This was not childcare. This was lineage maintenance, a survival strategy carved in bone and heat. But it was also emotional. To protect the young is to invest in the future, yes, but also to feel. Joy when a newborn's eyes opened. Sorrow when they closed and did not open again. and there were many who did not survive. The archaeological record cannot whisper names, but it can whisper numbers. In many early sites, child burials are more common than adult. The ratio tells a story not of neglect, but of harsh arithmetic. Even with constant care, the cold was merciless. And when fire did appear, rarely sporadically, what must it have meant? A stolen ember from a lightning-blasted tree, a moment of light and heat and protection. Perhaps it was placed near the child first, not for comfort, for preservation, flame as a temporary womb, as a last defence against the outside. But such fire never lasted long. Storms came, winds rose, sparks died in wet leaves, and then, once more, they were left with only each other. Still they endured, and as they did, their bodies remembered. Evolution favoured those whose skin could sense cold sooner, whose instincts urged closer huddling, whose arms curled tighter around the smallest members of the group. These were not changes in culture. These were changes in reflex, in blood, in the silent decisions of natural selection. What survives, over time, is not just strength, but attentiveness, the ability to notice a child's breath quicken, to feel the slight shiver before stillness, to know, without words, what warmth is worth. This knowledge, unspoken, intuitive, ancient, was passed down not in language but in posture, in gesture, in instinct. The way a mother shifted her body in the night to keep wind from a child's face. The way an elder shaped the opening of a shelter with their back, creating a windbreak without needing to explain why. These were not conscious strategies. They were responses trained by thousands of nights spent hovering over the edge of survival, and this sensitivity, this human ability to feel for others, to anticipate the needs of the vulnerable, was not a luxury of later civilization. It was forged in the fireless dark. In fact, some of the earliest roots of human empathy may lie in that moment, when the survival of a species depended not just on the strong enduring, but on the weak being protected. Unlike many animals, whose young grow fast and walk within hours, our infants demanded long-term investment. And so, the evolutionary reward shifted, not just toward strength or speed, but toward care, toward those who could feel another's cold and respond before it turned fatal. And yet, for all this adaptation, there were still losses. In the chill of deep winter, when resources dwindled and snow buried the entrances to caves, even the best-wrapped infant could slip away in the night. A quiet gasp, a slower breath, a silence that stretched too long. And when it happened, when that tiny fire went out, what did the people do? Some bones tell us. There are burials, intentional and gentle, of the very young, long before religion, before writing. A grave at Dederie, Syria, where a Neanderthal child was laid curled in a shallow depression, red ochre sprinkled across the small skull. Another in Russia, at Sunghir, where a boy and girl were buried head to head, covered in ivory beads. These weren't acts of disposal, they were acts of memory, of grief, of reverence. To bury a child in the cold ground is not merely to return them to the earth, it is to acknowledge what the cold has taken, to mark the space where hope once pulsed, and still, they tried again. This is the deeper resilience, not just the ability to survive, but the decision to keep creating life in a world where life is always at risk. Every pregnancy was a wager, every birth a new vulnerability, and yet the species moved forward, step by step, breath by breath, child by child. Because in the end, the fire wasn't just something they lacked, it was something they imagined, something they longed for, not only to warm themselves but to keep the next breath of the smallest among them safe. They didn't have it yet, but even in its absence they were already building their lives around its promise. Fire, not just as heat but as idea, as destination, as ghost. Even without mastery, even without spark, it hovered at the edges of their lives like a thing remembered from the future. A warmth they could almost reach, but not quite. And so, in its place, they created a different kind of fire, made not of flame, but of flesh. Infants pressed to skin, hides layered over hides, shelters thickened with moss and bark, positioned with aching care to catch the morning sun. These were not just survival tactics, they were declarations. Here is where life continues. Here is where the cold does not win. The cold tried. It swept through river valleys and over glacial plains. It tested the seams of every shelter. It looked for weakness, and it found it, often, in the quiet chest of a newborn. But the humans pushed back, not with firewood, but with proximity, with touch, with constancy. The very act of sleeping beside an infant became defiance. A warmth passed down through bodies, a living chain resisting the freeze, and in time, much later, the fire would come. Not in this chapter, not yet. But already something was changing. Already they were learning what warmth meant, not just thermally, but emotionally, psychologically. They were beginning to centre their world around the young, to measure value not in strength alone, but in tenderness, to wrap not just their children, but their identities, in the long, slow burn of care. It is possible, just possible, that fire did not civilize us, that we civilized ourselves while reaching for it. Because even when the embers failed, when the coals turned cold and the smoke blew away, something remained. The shape of the circle, the instinct to gather, the silence that fell not from absence, but from attention, the whole group listening all at once to the breathing of a single infant. In this way, the child became the flame. To hold an infant in the cold and keep them alive without fire is not just survival. It is art. It is architecture. It is a meditation on fragility so profound it shaped our evolution. The loss of a child was the loss of future, but the care of a child, that was the forging of humanity. And so, across generations they kept going, teeth chattering, backs sore, eyes heavy from sleepless nights in dark shelters. But the baby lived, and then another, and then another, and in the deep time silence of a frozen world, the softest thing, the breath of a newborn, became the most sacred. They had no fire, but they had each other, and that for a very long time was enough to keep the light alive. Long before fire became a circle of safety, the night was not empty. It was occupied, claimed by others who never needed light to see, who thrived in silence, who moved without sound until it was too late to run. Hyenas with bone-cracking jaws, cave lions the size of horses, wolves that hunted in disciplined, coordinated packs. In the absence of flame, these were not distant dangers. They were the rulers of night. And humans? They were intruders, fragile, slow, sightless after dusk. They could not see through darkness. They could not warn with glowing eyes or defend with shearing teeth. Without fire, the night did not belong to us. What must it have felt like to try to sleep in such a world? Every rustle outside the shelter, every snapped twig, every gust of wind that sounded like breath, all of it became threat. Not in the dramatic sense of confrontation, but in the quieter, colder sense of vulnerability. One moment of drowsiness could mean the end, and the predators knew it. To them, humans were an anomaly, soft, slow, and huddled together like prey begging to be circled. Fire would have changed everything. A wall of flame, a ring of light, a declaration. We are here, and we are not yours to take. But for hundreds of thousands of years, that declaration could not be made at will. Fire, when it came from the sky, gifted by lightning, preserved in smouldering bark and carried like a secret. But it was fleeting. Rain, wind, or one careless moment and it was gone, and then the night crept back in, unchallenged. So how did they survive? They climbed. Whenever the terrain allowed it, early humans selected high ground, ledges, cliffs, trees, any vantage that gave warning, any perch that predators avoided. Some archaeologists believe certain sleeping sites were deliberately chosen not for their comfort, but for their defensibility. A ledge above a narrow gorge, a platform of stone surrounded by rubble. These were not homes. They were compromises, difficult to access, cold, but perhaps just high enough to buy a few extra minutes of warning. And when there was no elevation to be found, they built their own. Stone barricades, rings of boulders, piles of thorny brush. These were not fences in the modern sense. They were signals, deterrents, hopes carved into the landscape with blistered hands and aching backs. Because even if a wall could not stop a lion, perhaps it could delay one. Perhaps it could make the difference between escape and disappearance. Still, the fear never truly left. Because in the silence of fireless nights, the predator was not just real, it was omnipresent. It lived in the wind, in the pause between heartbeats, in the darkness just beyond reach. And what does it mean to build a life knowing that every night you might be hunted? It means you don't sleep alone, you don't sleep deeply, and you don't sleep all at once. Across the scattered groups of early humans, a strategy began to take shape. Not one written down, but one felt in the bones. Vigilance must be shared. Some stayed awake while others slept. A rotating watch, perhaps informal at first, then ritualized. The group arranged itself like stones in a river, with the young tucked in the centre and the most alert placed at the edges. Eyes half closed, ears wide open. This was not courage. This was necessity. Without fire, the human body at rest is exposed, defenceless, a warm signal in the cold night. A lion does not need to see you to know you are there. It can smell the salt of your skin, hear the flutter of your heartbeat, sense your stillness. The moment you stopped moving was the moment you became a target. So they learned to move even in rest, to shift, to stir, to make the night uncertain for those who watched from the brush, and they learned to listen, not to the wind, but to its absence, not to sound, but to silence. Because sometimes the quiet meant safety, and sometimes it meant something worse, a predator holding its breath. There are sites, ancient clearings in the archaeological record, where no hearths are found, but where layers of stone suggest human presence. In those places we can see the improvisation. Circles of heavy rocks not meant for warmth, but for warning. Sharp-edged tools placed deliberately near sleeping areas, perhaps as last resorts. And most telling of all, the bodies were never truly isolated. They rested close together. If one was taken, others would wake. If one stirred, all might stir. This group awareness, this shared sense of danger, may be one of our oldest collective instincts. Before language, before planning, there was the twitch in the night that roused 10 others. There was the hand reaching silently for a stone. There was the breath held as something moved beyond the edge of sight. And still, there was no fire. When it did appear, it transformed everything, just for a moment. Even a small flame extended visibility. It cast shadows. It lit up eyes. Predators, for all their power, are cautious. The unknown makes them hesitate. And for that brief time, the humans had the advantage. But when the storm came, or the ember died, the balance shifted back. The world returned to its natural state, cold, black, and full of watching things. So the people adapted, not by dominating the night, but by surviving it. They survived by knowing the ground, by memorizing escape paths, by sleeping in shifts, by placing the sharpest flint within arm's reach. They survived by becoming students of fear, not to defeat it, but to live beside it. Because in the world before fire, fear wasn't a signal of failure. It was information. It told you when not to move, when to lie flat, when to wake the others with a nudge instead of a cry. Fear kept the group alert, not only to sound and scent, but to the patterns that preceded attack. The sudden absence of wind, the unusual quiet of birds, the subtle shift in animal movement along the edge of a clearing. Predators are not reckless. They study, they wait, they understand rhythm, and they know when it breaks. So did the humans. This was the strange symmetry of prey and predator, both operating within the same logic, both aware of the silence that settles before violence. And it is the silence that leaves the deepest mark, not the growl, not the scream, but what comes just before, that moment when the group stiffens, breath held, eyes wide in the dark, when the fire is gone or never came, and there is nothing between you and the night but a wall of bodies and the hope that it will pass you by. This is where psychology begins to matter, because when every night is a test of endurance and luck, it isn't just bodies that tire, minds fray. The imagination, once a gift, becomes a threat. Every rustle becomes a stalker, every breeze a breath. The boundary between what is real and what is feared grows thin, and in the dark they begin to blur. What is fascinating, and deeply human, is that we learn to use even this. Fear did not always paralyze. In many cases it sharpened. A sleeping human may not be able to outrun a lion, but a human wide awake, alert, prepared, even without fire, has one advantage: cooperation. A single predator may approach, but a group can respond, throw stones, raise voices, brandish sharpened sticks. Some evidence suggests that even without flame, humans could coordinate defense through sound, low growls, sharp clicks, rhythmic shouts. Not speech, not yet, but signal, enough to confuse, enough to delay. And sometimes, delay was all that was needed. Predators don't like chaos. They seek control. They want their prey to behave, to run when expected, to freeze on cue. But early humans learned to disrupt that script, to make themselves unpredictable, to create patterns of vigilance that forced the predator to think twice. And when thinking took too long, the night passed, the moment was lost. The human children were still breathing. The group survived another dawn. Even without fire, they had begun to shape the darkness in small ways, not with light, but with presence, with sound, with stubborn refusal. The predators had the advantage, but they never had the final word. Because though humans were not the strongest, the fastest, or the best suited to the night, they had something else, an ability not only to endure the presence of fear, but to make meaning from it, to live in the shadow of lions and hyenas, and still create rhythm, community, and persistence. To sing, perhaps not aloud, but inwardly, in the cadence of breath, in the measured passing of time, as they waited for night to pass. This was the spiritual dimension of life without fire. Without light to push back the dark became everything. The walls of the world collapsed inward. There was no horizon, only the faint shapes of others beside you. There was no distant future, only the next few hours. And in that crucible of uncertainty, early humans did something astonishing. They stayed. They stayed in the cold, in the silence, in the presence of death. They didn't run endlessly, or retreat into caves and never return. They continued to move, to explore, to settle briefly in dangerous places. Not because they were fearless, but because they had learned something deeper than fear: resilience. The knowledge that danger would come again and again, and that survival would be forged not through dominance, but through attention, through watchfulness, through the slow honing of instinct and memory. And they carried this knowledge with them, not just physically, but emotionally. Because being prey leaves a mark. It writes itself into your bones. It alters the way you see the world. You notice edges, shadows, the way the wind shifts. You begin to understand that every path is a story, and every story has a risk. And yet, you walk it anyway. This is not weakness. This is a kind of majesty, the majesty of creatures who live without power and still create life. In the archaeological record, we see few grand structures from these times. No temples, no monuments. But we do see subtle choices, campsites positioned near echoes, places where sound would bounce, providing early warning, sleeping circles made deliberately tight so that even a child's movement would be felt across the group. These are the architectures of the hunted. Quiet, low to the ground, nearly invisible, but precise. And in some places, bones tell a harder truth. Wounds on ribs, punctures in skulls, signs that the predator sometimes won, that the circle broke, that the night did not always pass gently. But these losses didn't end the story, they deepened it. Each tragedy was remembered, even if no words were yet spoken. Each night lost became a lesson carried forward, and so, fireless, hunted, surrounded, they endured. Because to be prey is not to be powerless, it is to be awake. And that wakefulness, born in fear, shaped in darkness, would one day become vision. The kind of vision that does not just respond to danger, but anticipates it. That maps the landscape not only for food and shelter, but for echoes and exits. That sees the world not in hours, but in cycles. It was this vision, forged under the watching eyes of predators, that shaped the early human mind. But it came at a cost. There is a kind of fatigue deeper than muscle. The exhaustion of being watched, of knowing you are never alone, of sensing that even when you lie perfectly still, something is deciding whether or not to come closer. That each night is not just a passage of time, but a question. Will the circle hold? Without fire there was no boundary, no line to keep the wilderness out. Darkness had no perimeter. The cold had no edge. And yet humans, fragile, furless, small, made something sacred from that exposure. They learned how to sleep not just with each other, but for each other. They arranged their lives around vigilance, around trust, around the hope that morning would come again. Still, fire remained the missing piece, a solution just beyond reach. Those who had once seen it, in a lightning-struck tree, in the smoulder of a fallen branch, must have dreamed of it, not as a tool, but as a memory, as a god, as a lost son that could be summoned at will. Imagine the longing, to sit with others and see each face, not as silhouette, but as self, to cast light into the brush and see not eyes, but empty space, to know, truly know, that the dark could be pushed back. This longing shaped not only their behaviour, but their imagination. Long before they could command flame, they gathered around its idea. They returned to lightning-struck patches of earth. They touched the embers of dying fires with reverence. They carried smouldering branches across miles, feeding them with dry grass and hope. It was not reliable. It did not last. But it was enough to create a silhouette of safety, a glimpse of what life could be. And so, the fireless years passed, centuries, generations, all under watch, all without light. But in surviving the predator's advantage, humans gained something of their own, a bond forged in danger, a discipline of watchfulness, and a patience that would one day pay off. Because fire was not simply the end of fear. It was the reward for having lived through it, and when it finally came, when the first reliable flame was born not of lightning but of will, the humans didn't just gain a new tool, they became something new, not the hunted, but the ones who held the night. Even when it was captured, it could disappear. A single gust, a single misstep, and all that stood between life and the void would flicker, stutter, and die. This was the nature of early fire, not conjured by will, but stolen from the sky, borrowed from chance, tended like a secret too delicate to speak aloud. Imagine living with that kind of light, not as a certainty, but as a miracle. In this Ice Age world, fire was not yet a possession. It was a visitor. It came in lightning, in fallen trees cracked open by storm, in the rare and reckless burn of dry brush. And when it appeared, it had to be cradled, lifted like an injured animal, protected against wind and water, sheltered from the very world it might otherwise defend you from. Those who stumbled upon it did not merely find warmth. They found a door to a different kind of night, but the door never stayed open for long, because fire then was not yet ours. It was not summoned from stone or sparked from memory. It was brief, perishable, dependent. A branch might burn for a few hours, a clump of embers might smoulder through the dusk, but every moment of survival depended on movement, on vigilance, on not letting the wind rise too quickly or the rain fall too hard. What happens to hope when it's extinguished not by failure, but by weather? Archaeologists have searched the old layers of Europe and Asia for answers. In the oldest cold sites, 1,800,000, 600,000 years old, they find signs of char but not hearths, burned bones scattered without pattern, ash layers without containment. Flame was there, but not kept. The earth remembers brief visits of warmth, but not permanence. What does that mean for the people who lived within those flames? It means they were never sure, never safe. That even the miracle of fire could be a source of dread. Because once you've known its warmth, its light, its calm, how do you go back to the dark? How do you return to the cold soil without resentment? What happens to the soul when the only protection you have is blown out by a passing storm? And the storms did come, with a force we barely understand. Winds that tore through valleys like blades. Rains that soaked hides and drowned embers. In a world ruled by Ice Age weather systems, every fire was a gamble. Every night a countdown. The logs would burn, the wind would rise, the balance would break, and then there would be nothing. No light, no warmth, no memory of fire except the ache of its absence. And that absence was more than just a chill. It was a return to powerlessness, a reminder that, in this chapter of prehistory, humans still lived at the mercy of forces they could neither summon nor stop. Lightning was not a gift-giver, but a wild god, unpredictable, indifferent, and rare. The flash might strike miles away, The resulting fire might die before it was reached, or worse, the group might reach it only to find it uncatchable, already fading, soaked by the storm that had birthed it, and yet they tried. They carried smouldering sticks wrapped in bark and dried grass. They fed embers with breath and watched them die in the rain. Some groups may have buried coals under earth to protect them from wind, or tucked them into stone hollows to stretch the flame's life through the night. This was not mastery. It was a relationship, not control but courtship. Fire wasn't a tool. It was a thing you kept alive. And yet, even when kept, it often failed. The archaeological record whispers of these early frustrations. Sites such as Gesher Benot Yaakov, in what is now Israel, show burnt plant matter and charred flint tools over 700,000 years old. Clear signs that fire had been used. But there is no proof that it was made, no hearths, no fire pits, no patterns of controlled ignition, only the residue of something momentary, something found, not formed. In northern Europe, places like Beecher's Pit or Schöningen yield similar hints: burned animal bones, blackened sediments, even possible signs of fuel selection. But still, no clear evidence of the spark. The flame, it seems, was there, and then not, like a ghost, like breath in the cold. And when it vanished, it took more than heat with it. The loss of fire was the loss of structure. Without it, there could be no central place to gather, no way to dry soaked hides or soften tough roots, no protection from cold-blooded predators who feared the flicker, no signal to distant kin or returning hunters. Without fire, the night scattered the group, not only physically, but emotionally. Without the hearth, there was no centre. Without the centre, there was no circle, and in that dispersion, grief. We can only imagine the quiet devastation of watching a storm approach, of huddling over a fading ember, sheltering it with cupped hands, breathlessly coaxing life from it, only to feel the wind rise, the rain begin, the red turn to black. Imagine the silence that followed, the group waiting for the light to return and realizing it would not. There are no words from that time, but if there were, they might sound like mourning, not for a person, but for a presence, lost to weather, lost to time, and still needed, desperately, because once fire had been held, even briefly, it changed everything. Not just the practical rhythms of daily life, but the interior shape of longing. Once a child had slept by the warmth of flame, how would they ever forget it? Once a mother had seen her infant's face illuminated by more than moonlight, how could she ever return to the blind dark without sorrow? In this sense, fire became not just a physical phenomenon, but a kind of ghost, something that haunted those who had once known it, an absence with a shape, a warmth remembered in the bones, felt even when gone. Every storm that took the flame became a kind of erasure, not just of light but of belonging, and each time they had to begin again, as if climbing a mountain whose summit kept vanishing into cloud. We often imagine prehistoric humans as hardened survivors, purely practical in their decisions. But no one lives in such a world without inner life. To lose fire was to lose more than heat. It was to lose time. Night without fire is not the same night. It is longer, heavier, less forgiving. In the glow of flame there can be stories, gestures, glances. But in the pitch dark, there is only silence, only breath, only the slow tightening of fear around the hours. And so, strategies were born. They learned to mimic the hearth in its absence, huddling tight for shared body heat, building stone windbreaks around dying embers, perhaps even using moss or dung to insulate the smoulder. They experimented with dry tinder, folding bark and grass together like offerings. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. And in that gap between effort and failure, a strange kind of hope endured, because the loss of fire never meant the loss of memory. On the contrary, it may have strengthened it. Those who lived through fire's vanishing would have carried the lessons like scars. Perhaps they began to track the seasons more closely, to read the sky for signs of incoming rain. Perhaps they stored dry kindling in caves or hollow trees. Perhaps they taught children the importance of stillness near the flame, the dangers of breath too strong, of play too wild. Even before fire was mastered, it had already become sacred, not just as warmth, but as wisdom. And that wisdom was communal, because no one could tend the flame alone. The entire group bore the burden of its survival. One person watched it by day, another by night. Someone fetched wood, someone else shielded it with their body during storms. The fire, in this way, became an early act of society, a shared task that transcended hunger or strength. And when it failed, when the last ember died, they mourned not just a resource, but a covenant. One they would, again and again, try to renew. This cycle of finding, feeding, losing became one of the deepest rhythms of early human life. Like the turning of the moon, or the return of the herds, the coming and going of fire defined the limits of what was possible. With it, they expanded. Without it, they endured. And in between, they waited. The flame became a measure of time and trust. The hours it stayed alive told you something about your kin, your shelter, your sky. Sometimes it lasted a day, sometimes a week, but never enough. The ingenuity of those who tried to prolong it cannot be overstated. They learned to read the wood. That damp pine burned poorly, but dry birch sparked quick. That certain mushrooms, when dried, could hold a coal longer than bark. That if you packed moss around the base of a burning branch, you might protect it from sudden wind. These were not technologies as we know them. They were rituals, experimental, desperate, and often beautiful. Some may have built crude windshields from slabs of stone or animal bones. Others perhaps dug shallow pits to shield embers from being drowned. Still others, in times of travel, may have carried fire in hollow horns, walking not just with tools but with light itself, a light so easily lost, and when it was, when the smoulder turned to smoke, the glow to grey ash, the group had no choice but to return to cold methods. Animal fat rubbed on skin, sleeping in clusters, the slow misery of raw roots and frozen marrow. But more than the body suffered, the mind did too, because each extinguished flame reminded them of what they lacked most: control. They had seen fire, yes, but they had not yet made it, and this is the dividing line, the heartbreak at the centre of this chapter. Because these were not people unaware of flame, they were not untouched by its grace. They had tasted it, slept beside it, fed it with scraps of meat and watched the fat sizzle. They knew what it could be, they just couldn't summon it when they needed it most. Imagine the psychology of that. To live in a world where the one thing that could transform your night into safety, your hunger into nourishment, your fear into calm, remained forever uncertain. Like knowing the cure but not the recipe. Like holding the key but never finding the lock. It must have changed them, and perhaps more importantly it bound them. Because fire demanded more than skill. It required attention, commitment, a community not just of warmth, but of vigilance. You did not simply possess flame. You earned it, moment by moment, and in doing so, you became something new, a creature of memory, a keeper of loss, a watcher of light. And what a fragile thing it was. In this age before mastery, fire was not a thing you could count on. It was a guest who left without warning. Its presence transformed the world, but its departure returned it to something more ancient, more unforgiving. Without fire, shadows crept closer. The cold pressed harder. Hunger grew sharper. And though the stars remained above, they gave no heat. Only witness. The people remembered. Not in writing, but in gesture, in caution, in reverence. Perhaps a child, once scolded for playing too close to the flame, grew to be the one who shielded it most fiercely. Perhaps an elder, once burned, learned how to tell by smell when the coals were dying. These were lessons passed not in language, but in pattern, observed. Embodied, lived. It's tempting to think of these early humans as less than us, less clever, less capable. But such thinking dissolves when we truly consider their reality. They lived without the comfort of ignition, yet still fought to keep fire alive. They planned for its loss. They grieved its vanishing. They restructured their lives around the hope of its return. Is that not intelligence? Is that not devotion? Even now, the archaeological layers preserve these flickers of effort. Charcoal in wind-blown caves, burnt bones scattered across open tundra, ashes trampled by ancient feet. These are not just marks of warmth. They are the fingerprints of persistence, of people who, without matches, without lighters, without even the flint and pyrite tools that would come later, tried to hold on to something they did not yet understand. And slowly, over thousands of years, something began to shift. Perhaps it was an accident, a spark struck when flint hit stone. Perhaps it was observation, the way dry grass sometimes smouldered near certain rocks. However it happened, the idea must have taken root, like the first dry ember in a nest of tinder. Could fire be made, not just found, not yet, not here, but soon? For now, we remain in the age of vanishing flame, a time not of mastery but of mourning, where every storm was a threat, every gust a betrayal, every wet footstep through the hearth a disaster. And in that world, resilience did not mean control. It meant beginning again, again, and again. So we close this chapter not with triumph, but with tenderness, for the ones who tried, who ran into the storm with a smouldering stick, teeth clenched against the rain, who knelt by the dying ember as if it were a child, who watched the dark return, and still, when morning came, gathered dry leaves and hoped, because one day it would not vanish, one day the flame would stay. You do not feel hunger as a number. You feel it as a slowing, a dullness in the limbs, a fog behind the eyes. You feel it when the cold touches bone more quickly than it used to, when walking uphill feels like lifting stone. In the ice-bitten world before mastery of fire, hunger was not the space between meals. It was the shape of life itself. And when fire could not be summoned, the body was forced to gnaw its way through the raw offerings of a frozen earth. Sinew and gristle, tendons like cords, meat so cold it stung the teeth and numbed the jaw. But cold flesh brings little warmth. Without fire, every calorie had to be wrung from food through the labour of digestion alone. The stomachs of these early humans, descended from omnivorous ancestors, but adapted to higher meat consumption in the north, worked overtime to break down raw proteins. This effort came with a hidden cost. Unlike a cooked meal, raw meat carries with it not only the burden of bacterial threat, but a metabolic tax, an invisible siphoning of energy, stolen by the very act of processing what has been swallowed. And in sub-zero climates, where the body was already in debt from constant thermoregulation, that cost could be fatal. What does it mean to eat when eating makes you colder? Even the act itself was a ritual of survival. The meat, sometimes scavenged from kills left by lions or hyenas, might have to be hacked loose with crude stone flakes, smeared with dirt and hair clinging with ice. Fat was prized, marrow hoarded, but lean meat, stringy muscle with little lipid cushion, could not sustain a starving body. Protein poisoning, now rare and obscure, once stalked the fireless eater. When forced to subsist on nearly pure meat without plant matter or fat to balance it, the body can turn on itself, digesting organs, weakening the heart, draining what little strength remains. Some anthropologists call it rabbit starvation, but for these early humans it wasn't a curiosity. It was a known, unwelcome return. So how do you eat when the meal fights back? Some may have learned to ferment, to hide meat beneath earth or ice, softening it with time. Others may have gnawed bones for traces of fat long after the muscle had rotted away. This was not cuisine. This was the arithmetic of endurance, counted not in recipes but in chewed sinew and bitter root. And through it all, fire remained the ghost at the feast, the tool that could have transformed the entire equation if only it would come. But it did not come, not on command, not yet. And so they ate what the wolves left behind. And what happens to a mind, to a people, when nourishment is not a gift of the land, but a punishment from it? The answer lies not in starvation alone, but in erosion. Not a cliff collapse, but a slow hollowing of strength. In the absence of fire, every meal was a battle the body barely won. Raw meat might fill the stomach, but it left the body wanting, not just in energy, but in utility. Because while Homo erectus and later Homo heidelbergensis could chew and swallow uncooked flesh, they could not do so efficiently, and over time this inefficiency became its own kind of predator. Cooking does more than warm food, it unlocks it. Heat denatures protein, softens connective tissue, and breaks down cellular walls. A cooked piece of meat yields more usable calories, not just faster, but more completely. It is, in effect, predigestion by flame. Without that assistance, the body must work harder and longer to harvest what little energy it can, and that effort produces heat that the cold quickly steals. Digestion becomes an internal fire, one easily extinguished from the outside in. In freezing climates, this trade-off was brutal. Imagine gnawing on a frozen haunch of scavenged meat. Your jaw aches, your core temperature drops, your intestines struggle to make use of what you've eaten, even as your muscles tremble from exertion and cold. You're not starving, not yet, but you're not recovering either. And in the Ice Age, to fail at recovery was to slowly vanish. There were other dangers too. Raw meat is a gamble. Even fresh, it can carry pathogens. Parasites invisible to the eye. Bacteria that multiply in minutes once warmth returns to a corpse. A fireless human, tearing into scavenged meat, or even a fresh kill took that risk with every bite. No flame to sterilize, no boiling to cleanse, only instinct and luck. In some cases, the meat may have been so cold that bacteria remained dormant, frozen alongside the muscle. But one shift in weather, one late afternoon thaw, and what once seemed edible turned lethal, and yet they kept eating. Because there was no choice. Plant matter was scarce in glacial environments, and the few roots or berries that survived were seasonal, fleeting. In winter, the menu narrowed to one dish: meat, cold and hard and never enough. Fat, when found, was a treasure, dense with calories, slow to spoil, quick to restore. But it was rare. The game was lean, especially after long migrations. Even the bones sometimes rang hollow. So they gnawed, not for taste, but for time. Time bought in scraps, in tendon, in sinew. Time without fire, without warmth, without the simple transformation that cooking could bring. And the hunger they carried was not just for meat, it was for power over it. Because without fire, food was not a guarantee of survival. It was a wager. Even a feast of raw meat, freshly carved from a fallen bison or horse, might feed the stomach while starving the body. The outer signs of fullness were deceptive. What mattered was not how much one ate, but what the body could use, and cold digestion is a slow betrayal. The stomach fills, but the limbs weaken, the blood cools, the mind slips. Fire could have changed all of it, but it hovered just beyond reach, a miracle glimpsed and then lost. What did this mean for the bodies that endured this diet? They were lean, certainly, not by choice but by necessity. Fat was stored sparingly and burned quickly. Muscle was earned and eroded in the same week. Children grew slowly, if at all, their caloric intake barely matching the demands of their expanding brains and shivering metabolisms. Women especially bore the cost. Pregnancy requires surplus, not deficit, and lactation even more. Without fire to cook fat-rich broths or soften marrow for easier access, even the most resourceful mothers struggled to feed themselves, let alone the infants at their breast. And when energy was scarce, decisions had to be made. Hunt or rest, walk or wait, share or hoard. Every action came with a toll, and without fire to amplify food's benefits, the margin for error shrank to a razor's edge. A single misstep, a spoiled meal, a spoiled stomach, a spoiled hunt, could tip a group from subsistence to collapse. And this fragility echoes through the archaeological record. Burials of the young, scattered campsites with few signs of long-term occupation, toothwear patterns that suggest desperate chewing of unyielding tissues, raw hide, tough roots, frozen flesh. These people were not failing. They were surviving under conditions nearly impossible to imagine. Because cold is not just cold, it's a multiplier. It magnifies hunger, it accelerates exhaustion, it erases the benefit of calories by forcing the body to spend them immediately just to stay alive. In such a world, fire was not an accessory. It was the difference between stability and attrition, the line between a body that recovered and a body that withered. And yet, for most of early human history in glacial zones, fire was not a line they could cross at will. It was not summoned, it was not banked, it was found or borrowed or prayed for. So meat, the very substance of life, remained just out of reach of its full potential, and that gap between what the food was and what it could be carved its own wound into the story of survival, not one of starvation, but of slow, aching depletion. Because without fire, meat was only half a victory. To kill an animal was hard. To keep the meat edible without rot or scavengers was harder still. But to truly make it nourishing, to render it soft, digestible, sustaining, required heat. And in this age, heat was not assured. It was a rare confluence of luck and landscape. Perhaps a lightning strike lit a dry patch of grass. Perhaps volcanic activity gifted warmth to a cave mouth. In these moments, the impossible became possible. A flame crackled, and for a brief window meat transformed. It was in these interludes that fire revealed its power not merely as a physical phenomenon, but as an agent of meaning. With fire, food was no longer simply consumed, it was prepared. That act of preparing, transforming, choosing how a thing is eaten, is foundational to human culture. But when the flame vanished, that thread was broken. The eater returned to something more primal, more animal, tearing, gnawing, enduring, surviving, and yet the desire to do more than survive burned in parallel with the desire to cook. Fireless meals were quiet admissions of helplessness. They said, "This is what we have, this is what we must do." But when fire was there, even briefly, it invited another voice. This is what we could become. That first roasted haunch of meat must have tasted like revelation. Not just warmth and fat and ease of chewing, but a glimpse into another world. One where energy was not bled dry by digestion. One where eating restored strength rather than slowly draining it. Even the smoke had meaning. It signalled presence. It carried scent. It offered a kind of claim on a landscape. And the flame, fragile though it was, served as a centre. Around it, meat was passed perhaps tentatively, perhaps reverently. It was not yet ritual, but it was no longer random. It was becoming something else. But when that fire flickered out, the reversion was swift. Meat froze again. The ease of chewing disappeared. Bellies that had felt briefly full now strained to keep up. And with the cold came a reminder that the benefits of fire were fleeting, that food could be reclaimed by hardship in a single gust of wind. This is why early hearths, when they appear in the archaeological record, matter so much. They are not just signs of burning, they are signs of commitment, a willingness to stay, to protect the flame, to turn food into more than fuel, into something shared, transformed, elevated. But those hearths were rare, scattered, intermittent, and for hundreds of thousands of years, most meals were not taken by firelight. They were taken under clouded skies or in wind-blown ravines, cold meat clenched between chattering teeth, and the absence of fire became more than logistical. It became existential. Because what was at stake was not just warmth or safety or even nourishment. It was the very definition of what it meant to live rather than to persist. Eating raw flesh in the wind, the early humans were not simply hungry, they were unfinished. Fire, that fleeting, uncontrollable miracle, was the missing verb in their story. It was the difference between feeding and dining, between surviving and shaping. To eat without it was to remain a creature of the elements. To eat with it was to begin to master them. Cooking, when it finally became reliable, would mark a biological revolution. But before it was science, it was longing. For hundreds of millennia, every mouthful of frozen meat carried that unspoken yearning. For food that was more than necessity, for warmth that came from within. The smell of singed hair from a lightning-scorched carcass, the brief sweetness of warmed marrow, the accidental taste of transformation. These were the memories that haunted them, a promise that the world could be altered and that their place in it could change. Without fire, hunger never ended. It only paused. The cold body burned more calories just to remain alive, stripping itself of reserves, turning survival into a spiral of diminishing returns. No matter how much they ate, they were always falling behind. Each kill bought them a few more days, a few more nights of shivering sleep. They were rich in protein, poor in heat, like wanderers in a feast made of ice. And yet, through this hardship, a truth was forming. Fire was not a luxury, it was a threshold, a symbol of choice in a world that offered none. To hold flame was to decide when to eat, how to eat, and what that act would mean. It gave shape to the day, turned chance into ritual, and hunger into culture. It made food something shared, not just consumed. And in that sharing, humanity, as we would come to understand it, began to flicker into existence. But before that dawn there was still the dark, the cold meat, the ache of jaws, the slow wear of teeth against tendon and bone. There was still the endless chewing, the hollow bellies, the gnawing fatigue. There were still the endless days of movement through snow and stone, hunting what could be eaten raw because there was no other way. And yet beneath the exhaustion, a spark remained, not in the hearth, but in the mind. A growing awareness that the flame was not a gift to wait for, but a mystery to solve, that the heat of lightning might one day live in their hands. The day would come when hunger itself would be rewritten, when meat would no longer freeze them from the inside but fortify them against the cold. But that day was still distant, for now they chewed in silence, teeth cracking ice, dreaming not of gods or tools but of warmth that stayed. The cold could not be fought, only shaped around. In the long silence before mastery of fire, the earth itself became the only ally. When flame could not be summoned and warmth could not be built, the ancestors of humankind turned instead to the world's skin, to bone, to hide, to frozen soil. They burrowed, they wrapped, they leaned against the wind instead of resisting it. Every shelter they made was not defiance, but a quiet conversation with the cold. How do you survive in a world that will not warm to you? You listen to it. You learn its edges. You learn to hide within its stillness. Across the frozen plains of Eurasia, the record whispers of those shelters, faint but unmistakable traces of hands that refuse to give up. Mammoth bones stacked in rings, tusks laid in circles to support hide walls, ribs used as roof beams. Near the great rivers of Ukraine and the Czech plains, archaeologists have unearthed entire villages made of the dead. The ivory arcs of the mammoth, curved and fused by ice, formed the skeletons of dwellings, circles of survival standing pale against the tundra. Inside them, small stones and bones were blackened not by steady fire, but by short-lived sparks, the ghosts of heat too brief to linger. These shelters were not grand. They were low, claustrophobic, pressed close to the ground. The ceilings hung only high enough for a body to crawl beneath, but that closeness was a kind of mercy. The body's warmth trapped, multiplied, passed from breath to breath. Layers of hide sealed the seams, bundled grass softened the floor. The air inside would have been heavy with musk and earth and animal grease, the scent of endurance. And when no bone or hide could be found, they turned to earth itself. They dug into riverbanks and permafrost, shaping hollows where the wind could not reach. These were not the spacious caves of later ages, but scraped shelters, shallow, fragile and temporary. Yet even these gave something precious. A pause, a moment of stillness in a world that never stopped taking. In the absence of fire, the ground became surrogate hearth. The soil absorbed what little heat the body produced and gave it back slowly in whispers. The walls held not flame, but presence, and in those damp, dark burrows life continued, the slow breathing of species unwilling to vanish. It is here, perhaps more than anywhere, that humanity's character took shape, not in triumph, but in adaptation. Not by bending the world to their will, but by bending themselves to its demands. Because before there was mastery, there was mimicry. Before there was firelight, there was earthlight, a warmth borrowed from the bones of the world. This was not comfort as we know it, but survival written in texture and proximity. The earth did not blaze, it muffled. It swallowed sound, dampened wind, held the faint heat of flesh the way stone holds sun after dusk. To live within it was to disappear, into the soil, into the ribs of animals, into the quiet. Yet disappearance was safety. When the predators moved across the ice at night, the hidden survived. Some of the earliest known shelters, like those uncovered near Bilsingsleben in Germany or Terra Amata in southern France, show this early genius in its embryonic form. Circular foundations of post holes, impressions of hide or brush, a ring of stones forming a low wall. Perhaps there had once been a covering of reeds or grass. Perhaps bone frames bound by sinew. Inside, the traces of tools and flint flakes, evidence not just of occupation, but of community. These were not permanent homes. They were brief sanctuaries, constructed and abandoned as the herds moved and the ice advanced. But in their design, you can sense the slow unfolding of an idea. That home is not a structure. It is a pause in the storm. Hide became their insulation. Skins scraped clean, dried and softened by hand until pliant enough to wrap around bodies or stretch across openings. The hides of reindeer, bison, or woolly mammoth, thick, layered with fat, were especially prized. When draped over bone or stacked against earth, they formed barriers against wind that no fireless flame could match. Beneath these coverings, humans slept pressed together like embers, generating warmth from their own closeness. In the still air of those makeshift dens, condensation gathered on the roof, frozen breath marking the boundary between inside and out. Each shelter was a collaboration between body and landscape. A mammoth's tusk became a beam. A cave wall became a door. The wind's direction determined where an opening could face. In this intimacy with nature, survival became a kind of craftsmanship, sculpting air, shaping space, learning the grain of the frozen world. And though the archaeological record gives us only fragments, bone circles, soil discolorations, scattered tools, these remnants speak of astonishing ingenuity. They tell us that the absence of fire did not mean the absence of warmth, only that warmth had to be carved out by hand. But even within these shelters, the cold was never gone. It pressed at the seams, crept beneath hides, and licked the edges of sleep. The earth could hold heat, but it could not make it. And so, night after night, early humans learned the art of waiting, of listening to the wind and measuring its patience. Because until the flame could be mastered, they would have to live inside its memory. That memory, the ghost of warmth, became their teacher. When fire vanished, they built warmth in layers, of earth, of skin, of each other. In the silence of those long glacial nights, survival was not a matter of invention, but of endurance, the art of lasting through what could not be changed. They learned to seal the wind out with stone, to trap breath beneath hides, to burrow deeper into soil until the world above was only a muffled hum. What the fireless human understood better than any creature around them was that warmth could be borrowed, if not created. The earth held it, flesh generated it, hides remembered it. Even snow, when packed tight and shaped just right, became an insulator rather than a killer. Some may have built low snow mounds, crude precursors to the igloo principle, though no trace could survive millennia of thaw. The body's ingenuity was its only flame. Archaeological layers in places like Moldova and Kostenki preserve ghostly rings of mammoth bone, lined with debris and crushed shells, faintly suggesting hearth-like centres where warmth once gathered. But the carbon traces are weak, irregular. If these were fires, they were not stable. If they were merely darkened soil, the illusion of flame was heartbreakingly close. Still, the layout of these shelters, tight, inward, protective, reveals a pattern. Humanity learning to build warmth not through ignition, but through enclosure. Inside, life slowed to a hum. Breath froze in air, then fell like mist upon hide walls. The smell of animal fat, wet hair, and earth filled the confined dark. Children cried softly, then were hushed, not out of fear, but conservation, because even sound seemed to waste heat. Everything was intimate. Every gesture mattered. The act of pressing closer to one another became as essential as hunting or crafting. In this, the fireless found something unexpected. Community born of necessity, tenderness born of cold. Perhaps that is where empathy began, not in language or art, but in shared breath beneath a mammoth hide. Firelight would later illuminate faces and stories, but before that glow there was only touch, only nearness. The warmth of another body was the first hearth. Even without flame, they became keepers of heat. The memory of it, how it moved, how it felt, how it transformed, was preserved not in mind, but in instinct. When the chance came to touch it again, when lightning struck or lava glowed, they would know what to do. They would remember how warmth felt against skin, how light danced on bone, how stillness gathered around its centre. The shelters were not just protection, they were rehearsals for the fire that would one day return and stay. Each shelter, each ring of bone, each hollow in the permafrost was a rehearsal for something greater. It was an act of shaping the world to reflect a need. These early humans were not building houses, they were building possibility. And in the repetition of that act, cutting, stacking, wrapping, binding, they were practicing the same logic that would later guide the tending of flame. Protect the core, guard the edges, feed the centre. The land itself offered the script. In places like Dolní Věstonice and Mezurich, remnants of mammoth bone dwellings tell a story older than architecture. Tusk arcs form doorways, shoulder blades serve as shingles. The curved ribs of giants rise like rafters. To us they seem alien, monuments of ivory and earth, but to those who built them, they were simply continuity. The mammoth fed them, clothed them, and finally sheltered them. Life and death had merged into one structure, one cycle. Inside, hide walls were anchored with stakes and stones. Entrances faced away from prevailing winds. The ground was lined with moss and fur to hold warmth, a fragile equilibrium that might mean the difference between living and freezing. A hearth was sometimes present, but more often only its outline. Ash so faint it might be dust. The suggestion of a fire, not its memory. Which makes sense, they could not always keep it. A single storm, a single night of rain could erase weeks of effort. Yet they built as if it would return, as if the flame might one day belong to them. And so, the earth became their teacher, not only in endurance but in design. They learned that air could be trapped, that space could be shaped, that warmth could be multiplied by thought. From this came everything: clothing, shelter, architecture, eventually even culture itself. Every future home, every wall, every hearth traces its ancestry to those first cold chambers dug into soil and bone. But survival was never guaranteed. Even the most intricate bone circles could collapse under snow. Hides stiffened into stone when frozen, tearing in the wind. A collapsed roof could mean death for all within. Repair was constant. Maintenance was devotion. Shelter was a living thing, tended, patched, understood. Theirs was not a world of abundance, but of relationship. Every object had purpose, every gesture consequence. In a time when warmth could not be summoned, everything was done to protect the heat that existed, in the body, in the breath, in the earth itself. And though they did not yet have a hearth, they had already learned how to build around one. The idea of the hearth existed before the flame. It was there, in the circles of stone, in the way bodies gathered inward, in the instinct to shield a fragile centre from wind. Long before humans learned to coax a spark from stone, they had already drawn the shape of belonging. That circle, that focus, that reverent enclosure, it was the architecture of yearning itself. In the frozen dark, the hearth was not a fire, but a space, the imagined heart of a home. And in building around that absence, early humans learned something fundamental: how to make meaning where nature gave none. The mammoth bone walls, the hide coverings, the hollows of earth, these were not simply shelters but symbols of intent. They said, this is where we stay. This is where warmth belongs, even if it has not yet come. The earth in return became both refuge and teacher. In its patience they learned their own. In its depth they learned endurance. They began to read the world as a partner, not an enemy to conquer, but a body to live within. The act of burrowing, of layering soil and hide, was an act of trust in the planet's permanence. Even without fire, they discovered how to live in rhythm with the land's breath. To imagine their lives is to enter a world almost completely dark. No glow against the snow, no embers whisper, only the dim reflection of moonlight on ice. And yet in that stillness something new was forming. Intelligence was not born in the blaze of invention, but in the long patience of necessity. The mind that learns to build from bone and hide is the same mind that will one day learn to build from flame. The archaeological record can only tell us fragments: a ring of mammoth ribs, a depression in soil, a scatter of tools. But each fragment hums with a kind of faith, a belief that the world could be shaped, that the cold could be answered, that the impossible, warmth, light, safety, could one day be summoned. These were not the dwellings of desperation. They were the first blueprints of hope. And so, even without fire, there was a kind of light. The light of understanding, the glow of perseverance, the warmth that came not from combustion, but from communion, with one another, with the world, with the quiet promise of what would come. They did not yet know how to keep the flame, but they knew how to make space for it. And that, perhaps, was the first spark, invisible, unlit, buried beneath the hides and bones and earth. The flame was coming, but before it could arrive, humanity had to learn where it belonged. When the sun fell, everything stopped. There was no soft descent into evening, no gradual dimming that invited reflection. Night arrived like a verdict, sudden, absolute and cold. Without fire, there was no second day inside the first, no late work, no stories whispered through the dark, no life beyond the horizon of the light. The dying of the day was the dying of the world itself. To live without flame was to measure existence by the sun's endurance. Every hour of daylight was an economy of survival, for hunting, mending, gathering, moving. When the light faded, so did agency. The eyes, once sharp and alert, dulled to blindness. Tools were dropped mid-use. Scavenged bones were left half-scraped. Even conversation, if there was such a thing then, fell away into silence. The day was a single breath, and the night was its long exhale. The absence of fire meant the absence of continuity. For us, light extends thought. It stretches time. But in the fireless ice age, cognition itself was bound to the turning of the planet. There was no future after sunset, only waiting. Civilization, in any embryonic sense, could not grow in the dark. Each dawn was a rebirth, each dusk an ending. Archaeologists searching for signs of night activity in early human sites often find only the blankness of absence. No soot layers, no charred debris, no glow of continuity in the record. The evenings were not times of innovation, but of retreat. Bodies curled into hides. Movement ceased. The only sound was breathing and the distant patient hunt song of predators who ruled the dark. And yet, the mind does not fully sleep. Even in darkness, it begins to imagine what it cannot see. The shadows move, take shape, acquire presence. The stars pulse above, vast and cold. To the fireless, these lights must have seemed unreachable, reminders of warmth that could not be touched. What stories did their minds form then in that endless black? Was the first myth not a story told aloud, but one whispered by the brain to itself? A dream of light, of something burning beyond the sky. Darkness is not emptiness. It is pressure. It compresses time and thought, forcing them inward. When light vanished, memory became fragile. A thing seen in day had to be carried through the night, not in the hand, but in the mind. In that fragile space, between forgetting and remembering, the first sparks of symbolic thought may have flickered, for the night demanded something extraordinary of them. Faith. Faith that the sun would rise again. Faith that cold was not forever. Faith that the unseen would return. And every morning when it did, they were reborn into light, for one more day's worth of sight, of motion, of meaning, before it died again. The rhythm of that dying shaped everything. Every evening was an ending, a slow surrender that could not be postponed. To live without fire meant to live inside a short, finite day, and the brain adapted to this rhythm. Vision narrowed, thought contracted. The vast imagination that would one day sculpt myth and art had not yet found its stage. Night crushed it into silence. What survived was instinct, the pulse, the breath, the ancient animal vigilance of listening for movement in the dark. In such a world, fear was not superstition. It was perception stretched to its limits. The dark was alive. It breathed through cracks, shifted through leaves, whispered in bone and snow. Every predator unseen was a presence felt, and so, each night, humanity rehearsed the same ritual, withdrawal. The day's tools were placed aside. The group pressed together. Children buried their faces against fur or hide. The wind became the only storyteller. Without firelight, memory itself was fragile. Darkness fractured continuity. Whatever was learned or made during the day risked dissolving with the sun. The rhythm of thought had to restart each morning from the body's stored sensations. Hunger, cold, fatigue. There were no lingering hours in which to ponder or plan. Every tool was born of daylight, and every dream was born of sleep. And yet the mind does not stop at its boundaries. Even when silenced by night, it begins to invent what cannot be seen. In that void of vision, something like imagination took root. Perhaps the first metaphors were not spoken, but felt, a shadow mistaken for a form, a sound mistaken for breath. The darkness made the brain reach outward, mapping absence as if it were presence. In this way, the long nights may have been the first canvases of myth. When all else disappeared, the stars remained. Sharp, cold, untouchable. They were the first unburning fires, unreachable and eternal. Beneath them, early humans must have watched and wondered. The constellations we name now had not yet been drawn, but the impulse to pattern the sky, to see order in the void, might have begun there, around those fireless shelters, in the silence between breaths. And so, the darkness was both a limitation and a teacher. It forced the mind inward, shaping an awareness of time itself, the recurring loss and return of light. The brain that awaited sunrise was the same brain that would one day invent the idea of tomorrow. But the cost was immense. Without fire, there was no night work, no safe movement, no craft beyond dusk. Tools lay unfinished. Hunts ended early. Wounds festered unseen. The world shrank with every sunset, the territory of the possible drawn smaller by each falling shadow. The night was not yet an environment to live in. It was an enemy to survive. But even an enemy teaches you who you are. Night without fire stripped everything away until only the essential remained. The rhythm of breathing, the awareness of others close by, the sound of your own heart. It was in these stripped-down hours that humanity learned the weight of isolation. The darkness did not only hide the world, it revealed the self. Without light, there were no boundaries between one body and the next, between the known and the imagined. The line between fear and thought blurred. Out of that blur came the earliest glimmers of introspection. To be human without fire was to exist in a strange tension, utterly vulnerable, yet capable of reflection. The absence of light forced the mind to make its own. In that invisible world, memory became an ember. It glowed faintly, keeping the shape of what had been seen, the sound of what had been said, the warmth of what had been lost. In those long intervals between dusk and dawn, the ancestors rehearsed the act that would later define them, keeping something alive inside the dark. When the sun disappeared, their shelters became islands of breath and heartbeat. There was no flame to circle around, but perhaps there was rhythm, the slow exchange of warmth through closeness, the murmur of wind beyond the hide walls, the subtle tremor of an animal moving nearby. It was a language without words, a way of saying we are still here. And though they could not see one another's faces, they learned to sense them, to recognize the shape of a shoulder, the whisper of movement. It was here that empathy grew teeth. The dark demanded cooperation. It punished solitude. One body alone would freeze, but many together could dream. In that enforced communion, early humanity found something sacred, not warmth, but belonging. Still, there was longing, always longing. The mind, pressed against the boundary of sight, began to hunger for continuity, a thread that could pass from day to night unbroken. Fire would one day serve that purpose, keeping the story of the day alive after the sun fell, allowing memory to stretch across the void. But in these early ages, that thread existed only in hope. Each morning, the world had to be rediscovered, each face relearned in the first light. There was no permanence, no night of reflection, no continuity between the world before sleep and the one after it. The mind woke up like the planet, blank and shivering, beginning again. And yet perhaps this too was necessary. The human story did not begin in mastery, but in repetition, in the act of losing everything to the dark and learning each day how to find it again. The first lessons of endurance were taught by night itself, and night, for all its cruelty, was also a teacher of pattern. In its silence, it revealed the pulse of cycles, the returning stars, the waxing and waning moon, the slow arc of sunrise after unbearable cold. These repetitions became the first constellations not of the sky, but of the mind. To survive the darkness, you had to trust that it would end. The moment you learned that, you had invented the future. Perhaps in those endless nights, as they lay pressed together in bone shelters and dugouts, early humans began to hum softly, not to call for company, but to steady themselves against the quiet. The sound was warmth. The rhythm was a heartbeat shared, and when the dawn finally came, that rhythm stayed in the chest, carried forward into movement and memory. That was the seed of ritual, not in religion or myth yet, but in repetition that comforted. The darkness became a shape to be endured, and therefore something that could be known. When light vanished, language would have fallen silent too. The gestures and glances that guided life by day lost meaning in the dark. But this deprivation may have deepened the other senses: smell, touch, hearing. Every creak, every shift of air, every murmur became data, vital and immediate. The brain began learning to listen beyond sound, to sense intention and mood. From this sensitivity, perhaps, came the first empathy and the first story, the awareness that another being's fear could be felt as your own. And in this strange sensory darkness, imagination found its scaffolding. Without the distraction of sight, the mind filled the void with what it wanted to see. A noise became a creature, a shadow became a memory, the sky became alive with presence. Out of these unseen forms, the idea of the spirit was born. The dead, the missing, the distant, all could return in the mind's eye when night fell. So when firelight finally came, it did not invent myth. It revealed what was already there. It gave the darkness a stage and the mind a mirror. For hundreds of thousands of years, though, this transformation was deferred. The fireless night remained the edge of thought. Civilization existed only in daylight, the realm of tools, of hunts, of visible work. The night was an unbroken interruption, a curtain that fell across every effort. But even without fire, the yearning for continuity grew stronger. You can almost feel it in the archaeological record. The way sleeping areas cluster close together, the careful placement of bones and tools before dark, as if preparing for morning's resurrection. They could not conquer the night, but they could prepare for its return. And that act of anticipation, was its own kind of light. Because even before the first fire was tamed, there was already a spark, not in the hand, but in the mind. The desire to extend the day was a form of rebellion against nature itself. To want more time, more sight, more warmth, was to imagine something that did not yet exist. The fireless night forced humanity to dream of a second sun, one that could live among them, glowing at will. Every evening of loss carved deeper that hunger for permanence, for a light that would not die. When the sun sank below the horizon, the body crouched and waited, but the mind lingered, unwilling to stop. Thought once lit does not dim easily. Even in the dark it tries to continue, to rehearse the day just lived, to hold on to what cannot be seen. It is in this quiet refusal that memory began to form, the ability to recall what light once revealed and to keep it alive through the void of night. And so, the absence of fire became the womb of imagination. Darkness demanded the invention of inner vision. It compelled the brain to preserve images, to invent continuity, to fill the gap between the known and the unseen. Out of that necessity came myth, and out of myth came meaning. When the flame finally came, it did not create these things. It merely gave them light. Yet for the fireless generations, night remained the great eraser. Everything not remembered was lost. The tools left unfinished at dusk were mysteries by dawn. Wounds unseen worsened in sleep. Death came quietly, folded in shadow. And still they woke each morning, blinking at the return of day, relearning the world one beam at a time. To live in such a cycle was to understand impermanence more deeply than we ever could. Every sunset was a rehearsal for extinction, and every sunrise, a resurrection. Perhaps that is why, when fire was finally mastered, humanity treated it with reverence. They had known what it was to live without it, to be exiled each night from sight, from sound, from each other, to lose language, memory, and meaning for half of every life. The first hearths, then, were not just shelters from cold. They were acts of defiance against oblivion. And when the first true night fire was kept alive, not borrowed from lightning, but made by human hands, it must have felt like the sun itself had been caught. The dark was no longer an ending, but a space that could be filled. The dying of the day would never again be final. For the first time in history, light stayed, and with it, time itself began to belong to them. Around 600,000 years ago, the first uncertain glow began to appear in the record of deep time. A scatter of ash in a cave floor, a few cracked stones darkened by heat, traces of char that whisper of something once alive. These were not yet hearths in the true sense. They were moments, flickers, coincidences made visible by the patience of geology. The world was still cold, still merciless, still ruled by the wind and ice, but for the first time something human had stayed alight just a little longer than the storm. We can almost see them now, small bands of Homo heidelbergensis huddled beneath overhangs or within shallow caves, carrying torches made from resin-soaked branches, their light sputtering and uncertain. The flame was not theirs to summon, it was borrowed from the wild. Perhaps it came from a lightning-struck tree or a burning grassland. Perhaps it was kept alive through the night in a shell of damp bark or in a hollowed bone. For a few days it must have felt like mastery, the miracle of control, the power to stretch the day. And then the rain would come, the wind would rise, the branch would dim, hiss and vanish. Archaeologists find the residue of this heartbreak across ancient Europe and Asia. Thin bands of ash without a hearth's boundary, scattered and faint. The story they tell is not of success, but of near success. The first firekeepers did not know the trick of making flame. They only knew how to fear its loss. Each spark carried from place to place was a small world of hope, guarded, worshipped, but never truly understood. What must that have felt like? To possess warmth for a day, then watch it die again. To know light not as permanence, but as a fleeting grace. The evidence is sparse, but eloquent. In sites like Beech's Pit in England and Gesher Benot Yaakov in the Levant, sediments hold layers of burned material, some deliberate, others chaotic. They speak of fire not yet mastered but courted, coaxed, then abandoned by the elements. The same hands that shaped tools of astonishing precision still could not strike a spark. This was the false dawn, a moment when hope seemed near enough to touch, only to fade into cold again. Humanity had reached out toward the divine, and the sky had withdrawn its gift, but something had changed forever. Because once a creature has seen its world illuminated, even briefly, darkness is never again the same. Once you've seen your own shadow moving against a wall, once you've watched your breath shimmer in the glow of something alive, you cannot return to the night unchanged. For the early humans who first borrowed fire, every spark must have felt like a promise, a glimpse of another kind of world, one in which the cold could be tamed, the predators kept at bay, the night made smaller. But it was a fragile dream. They had found the keyhole, yet not the key. To live with borrowed fire was to live in a constant state of fear, not fear of the dark alone, but fear of its return. Archaeological traces suggest that fires were tended obsessively. Charcoal fragments cluster near sleeping hollows, as if small coals had been nursed through the night. A few degrees of carelessness, a gust of wind, a lapse in vigilance, and the miracle was gone. Every dawn began the same anxious ritual. Check the embers, breathe them back to life if possible. Sometimes they succeeded. More often the cold reclaimed everything. It was a world that demanded patience, ingenuity, and grief. Imagine carrying the memory of light through a week of freezing nights, knowing that warmth was possible but not guaranteed. This tension between knowledge and helplessness may have been one of the great turning points of the human mind. For the first time, our ancestors were living with abstraction, the knowledge of something that could exist but did not. They had begun to long, and longing is one of evolution's most dangerous gifts. It makes a species restless. It seeds imagination, drives invention, refuses surrender. To long for what is lost is to start inventing ways to recover it. Every flicker of firelight not only warmed the body, but rewired the brain. It created a memory worth chasing. In that sense, the false dawn was not failure. It was ignition of another kind. The repeated loss of fire taught endurance, coordination, and shared responsibility. Fire could not be possessed by one person. It demanded the group. Someone had to guard it, another to feed it, another to find dry fuel in a wet world. It was a communal heartbeat, and every extinction was a shared mourning. Still, the pain must have been immense. For hundreds of generations the pattern repeated: hope, warmth, light, then rain, wind, cold, and darkness. Each loss would have carried the same hollow silence, the same cold hands fumbling for embers that no longer glowed. And yet, something within them refused to forget. Because even as the flames died, the memory of their warmth endured, a light now burning not in the world, but in the mind. That was how it began, the shift from survival to meaning. The flame had entered imagination. Fire was no longer just a force of nature. It had become an idea. Even when it was gone, it lived on in memory, and memory began to bind the human world together. Around those fragile hearths, or the places where hearths should have been, stories may have first taken shape, not spoken perhaps, but shared through gesture and gaze. Here is where the warmth was. Here is where it will be again. To live in the false dawn was to dwell in a world of ghosts, the ghosts of fires lost, of possibilities glimpsed. The ground itself bore their echoes, charred wood buried beneath new layers of frost, fragments of burnt bone among unburned ones, small patches of black where there should only have been pale soil. Archaeologists reading these traces today are reading grief turned to sediment, the evidence of yearning itself. Each failure was a teacher. Every time a flame died, our ancestors learned something about the fragile mathematics of life. How air feeds light, how moisture kills it, how stone shelters spark. They began to notice what burned well, what didn't, what crackled too quickly or smoked too long. Out of their mistakes emerged intuition, the slow gathering of knowledge that would one day become technology. But at the time, the experience must have felt cruel. They had touched the sun and been punished for it. Lightning could bring fire in abundance, yet the storm that birthed it would also snuff it out. A burning forest might glow for days, but approach it, and it would vanish beneath rain and ash. To chase fire was to chase contradiction, to follow life through destruction, warmth through danger. The early firekeepers lived on the knife edge between awe and loss, and still they returned. Even without knowing why, they were drawn back to the blackened places, the scars on the earth that held the memory of light. Perhaps they hoped to find embers still alive beneath the ash, or perhaps they came for something deeper, to feel again the trace of warmth on their hands, to remind themselves that it had been real. In these returns, we see the first rituals, acts not of religion, but of remembrance. Fire was no longer just a physical resource. It had become a moral and emotional one. The false dawn was a heartbreak repeated over millennia, but it was also rehearsal, a slow education written in flame and wind. And in every failure, humanity learned not just how to make fire, but why it mattered. Because fire, even when borrowed, reshaped everything it touched. It was warmth, yes, but also structure. A centre that drew bodies inward and gave shape to the group. Without it, life was scattered, nomadic, reactive. With it, even briefly, there was the suggestion of stillness. The first fire circles were the earliest architectures of community. In their flicker, distance collapsed. People became faces. Faces became memory. The flame turned strangers into a single breathing organism bound by need and attention. In this way, every early hearth, no matter how temporary, was also a kind of experiment in belonging. Each gathering around the light rehearsed the same lesson. To protect something together, fire demanded cooperation. It punished selfishness. A flame left unattended was a flame lost. And so, in guarding fire, humans learned to guard each other. Perhaps this is why the traces of ancient fire are often found at the centre of shelters or near the remains of shared meals. Those small pockets of warmth were not just tools, they were anchors for meaning. When the world outside was frozen and indifferent, the light within a hollow became a declaration. We exist. We endure. But the endurance was fragile. The evidence of those early fires, thin, ephemeral layers of ash, tells a story of repetition. They were lit, lost, and lit again, over and over, across centuries. The false dawn stretched across time like a long inhalation. Humanity was on the verge of something transformative, but the world was not yet ready to yield its secret. And yet, something deeper than technology was forming, a way of thinking that could imagine stability in a shifting world. Every spark carried forward an idea that life could be defended, that warmth could be restored, that the night was not eternal. These were not scientific insights, but spiritual ones, long before language gave them shape. The people of this age lived in uncertainty, and uncertainty is the mother of faith. They began to act as if the fire would return, to build as though it could last. The circular hearth pits found in ancient campsites were not functional yet. They were gestures of hope, small architectural prayers to continuity, and hope, once embodied, becomes evolution. The hands that built those fragile firings were learning coordination, patience, shared focus. The eyes that watched the last embers die were learning longing, and with longing comes imagination. Even as the light failed again and again, it left its imprint on the mind. The false dawn was not only a story of loss, it was the slow birth of meaning, the realization that the human journey itself was not about what burned, but about what refused to go out. For hundreds of thousands of years that was humanity's true fire, the persistence that outlasted flame. The world was still cold and the sky still indifferent, but something within the species had changed. They no longer simply endured the dark, they anticipated its ending. Every failed attempt to keep fire alive became a kind of rehearsal, a test of memory, discipline, and endurance. In learning to preserve flame, they were learning to preserve time, to stretch continuity across the fragile bridge between day and night. We know now that the first reliable hearths would not appear until much later, around 300,000 years ago. But in the false dawn, the pattern was already forming. A hand cupped against the wind, a spark shielded from the rain, the communal breath bent toward fragile embers. The ashes that remain from this time are like punctuation marks in the geological record, commas in a sentence still being written. Each one says the same thing: we tried. And those attempts, repeated endlessly, transformed the species. The struggle for fire forged new capacities: patience, cooperation, foresight. Each generation inherited not the flame itself, but the desire for it. And desire is far more enduring than heat. Fire could die 100 times, but the longing to call it back was indestructible. There is something profoundly human about this pattern. The nearness of success, the certainty of loss, and the refusal to stop trying. To live in that tension was to learn the emotional vocabulary of persistence, grief, hope, awe, resilience. Fire taught humanity not just how to survive, but how to yearn. Perhaps around those smouldering ashes, when the night closed in again, the mind began to build its first metaphors. Fire was life, its death was absence, its return, rebirth. Out of this simple rhythm, light and dark, warmth and cold, presence and void, the foundations of symbolic thought were laid. Even now, in language, in ritual, in every story told beside a flame, we are still tracing that first pattern. The false dawn ended not with mastery, but with understanding. Humanity had glimpsed its reflection in the fire, fragile, bright, impermanent, and begun to see that to keep something alive in this world required devotion. They would fail 1,000 more times before success, but the failures no longer felt final, because they had already learned the most important truth, that light can die and still be remembered, that memory can glow even in the coldest dark, and that sometimes the long path to mastery begins not in triumph, but in the endless, quiet act of trying again. Fire, once tamed, could die at the first touch of rain. The sky itself became the enemy. Each drop that struck the fragile coals was a reminder of the bargain early humans had made. To live by fire was to live by faith. They could warm their bodies, see the world beyond the reach of their eyes, cook what had once frozen their jaws, and yet all of it could vanish with a single storm. Fire was no longer a miracle they witnessed from afar. It was a god they served, trembling before its temper. To rely on fire was to accept risk. The open landscapes of the Ice Age, wide, wind-scoured plains and glacial valleys, were cruel to flame. The wind stole it, the rain smothered it. In the archaeological record, the story is written in fragments, layers of burned bone and charcoal in one layer, silence in the next, a hearth here, then none for miles. It is a pattern of absence, a stuttering rhythm, as though the earth itself were inhaling and exhaling light. What must it have felt like to wake to ash where warmth once was? The blackened circle on the ground, the smell of smoke already fading into damp air. The group gathers around the cold hearth, their hands hovering where the heat should be, waiting for something that will not return. Fire had been theirs, and now it was gone. Rain was not merely weather, it was betrayal. It fell like a test of devotion, asking again and again how much could be lost before faith faltered. Archaeologists at sites like Schöningen and Bilsingsleben find evidence of burned bone, but not of permanence. These were not the hearths of mastery, they were the remnants of desperation. Each one was a testament to a momentary victory against the cold, followed by defeat. In this way, fire became more than warmth. It became hope embodied, and hope, when extinguished, leaves a different kind of cold. The paradox of this age was that progress itself became danger. The more early humans relied on fire, the more helpless they became without it. They learned to build their shelters around it, to gather food expecting its flame, to survive nights because it burned. And yet, it was never certain. One mistake, one storm, one gust of wind, and the fragile light was gone, leaving them stranded in the same merciless dark they thought they had escaped. So they learned to wait, to hold coals under bark, to shield embers from rain with stones and hide, to nurse the last red glow through the night as though it were a heartbeat. Because even then, in the age of ash and rain, they knew if the fire died, so did the future. And so, every storm became a negotiation, between light and water, between knowledge and chance. Early humans had learned to guard fire with care bordering on reverence. They shielded it in pits lined with stone, cradled glowing coals inside hollowed bones, or wrapped them in damp moss to keep the embers alive through travel. Some may have even built rudimentary windbreaks, rings of rock that doubled as both hearth and altar. But no wall could hold against the full violence of the sky. The open plains of Europe and Western Asia offered little protection. Wind swept cold across the tundra, scattering sparks like dust. Rain flattened the fire's breath until all that remained was a hiss and the faint curl of smoke. There is evidence of this struggle in the sediments themselves, layers of burned bone interrupted by sterile, unburned ash, like pauses in a heartbeat. Archaeologists at sites such as Beech's Pit describe this rhythm as broken continuity, the record of a people who had not yet mastered the line between persistence and loss. And still, they tried. The fire, when it survived, transformed everything. Its light stretched the day, its warmth softened the edge of night. It made meat edible, fat digestible, and tools visible even in the gloom. For a few days the world seemed conquerable, until the next storm came. Then the illusion collapsed. Imagine it. The slow dread as the first drops hit the coals, the frantic attempts to cover them with hide or wood, the desperate fanning of dying embers as the smoke thickened into steam. When the last glow went out, silence would return like a weight. No matter how many times it happened, the grief must have been the same, because this was not just the loss of heat, it was the loss of mastery. The group would wait, hoping the rain might pass quickly, hoping that somewhere under the ash a coal still lived. But sometimes there was nothing. The cold took hold again, breath turned to mist, tools and hides stiffened, children cried in the wind. In that moment, even the ground seemed to turn against them. The soil that once held the warmth of flame now leached it away. Every loss of fire was a return to exile, not just from warmth, but from possibility. And yet the next day, when the sky cleared, they would begin again, searching for dry grass, for the memory of lightning, for the blackened trees left smouldering by storms. Fire could not yet be made, it could only be found, and so they became hunters not just of animals but of flame itself. They tracked it the way predators track movement, with attention sharpened by need. Smoke on the horizon meant more than distant burning, it meant hope. It meant that lightning had struck somewhere, or that dry grass had caught. They followed those plumes for miles, sometimes for days, through storms and hunger and fear, because to find fire was to find life. In that pursuit, fire became less a tool and more a presence. A thing with moods, with hungers of its own. It devoured wood and bone, breathed air, danced, hissed, retreated. It could be angered, soothed, or lost. The earliest humans must have come to sense this as personality, something larger than themselves. They fed it carefully, guarded it through the night, and when it died they mourned it as they would a companion. The pattern in the archaeological record reflects this intimacy. Burned bones, blackened, brittle, sometimes cracked by heat, are found alongside untouched soil, as though the hearth had been tended briefly then left to fade. These are not the traces of accidental burns. They are deliberate, chosen places of tending, but they lack consistency. Fire came and went, as unpredictable as weather itself. The layers of ash tell a rhythm of devotion and abandonment, of reverence punctuated by despair. When rain came, it was not just the extinguishing of warmth, but the erasure of a relationship. The sound of drops hitting flame, that sharp hiss, that sudden silence, must have been unbearable. It was the voice of the world reclaiming its balance, reminding them that what they had was never truly theirs. Still, they refused to stop believing. They built barriers of stone to protect the fire's heart, using bones and hides as windbreaks. They moved the flame inside shallow pits, shielding it with earth, the same earth that once served as their only warmth. The world was teaching them patience through destruction. The act of keeping fire alive became an early ritual of meaning. It required presence, coordination, vigilance. Each person had a role, one to guard, one to fetch fuel, one to feed the coals. The flame demanded community. It turned survival into ceremony, not through words, but through rhythm. And when it was gone, the world seemed emptier than before. Perhaps this is where the first prayers were born, not to the sky or the hunt, but to the glow itself. Hands outstretched over dying embers as if pleading with them to stay. The fire was not yet divine, but it was the first thing that made humanity kneel. And though it flickered and failed, they kept trying, because something in that fragile light mirrored their own impermanence and made it beautiful. For the first time in history, beauty and survival had intertwined. The flame was no longer just an instrument, it was a vision, something worth protecting not only because it warmed the body, but because it illuminated existence itself. Even in its fragility, or perhaps because of it, fire became the first mirror of the human condition, radiant, unstable, alive only through care. To keep it was to live attentively. The rhythm of tending became a teacher. Every ember required feeding, every moment demanded awareness of change. This vigilance, this sustained presence, was the seed of something revolutionary, time consciousness. The mind that learns to anticipate a dying flame learns to anticipate everything. In this way, the struggle to maintain fire was also the birth of planning, patience, and foresight. We can trace this transformation in the archaeological silence between hearths. Where fire vanished, survival grew more precarious. Where it lingered, so did innovation. Tools became more refined, shelters more deliberate, movements more seasonal. People began to understand the relationship between place and continuity, that to stay near a fire meant stability, and stability meant possibility. The fire's brief life forced them to imagine permanence, and yet the fragility never ceased. In the open landscapes of Pleistocene Europe and Asia, storms swept without warning. Lightning and rain arrived like verdicts. The wind carried embers away, scattering the work of days into the void. Ash would mingle with mud, erasing all evidence of light. Sometimes the only sign of a vanished fire was a ring of cracked stones and the memory of warmth in the soil. For those who lived it, the rhythm must have felt eternal, triumph and ruin, warmth and loss over and over. Each rekindling was a small act of resurrection, each failure a funeral. This cycle, repeated over millennia, may have been the forge in which emotion itself was tempered. Hope, despair, gratitude, grief, all were learned at the edge of the hearth. Even the sky seemed to participate. Lightning's sudden fire was both gift and punishment, its brilliance dazzling but untouchable. In its light, humanity saw both power and cruelty, creation and destruction in the same instant. The flame's dual nature became a reflection of their own, capable of creation, yet always shadowed by loss. Over time, this duality shaped behaviour itself. The act of protecting fire taught empathy. The need to share it taught trust. The inevitability of its loss taught humility. And each lesson endured longer than the light that inspired it. Ash in the Rain was not just the end of fire, it was the beginning of memory. Because to remember warmth after it dies is to know longing. And longing in the human story is the spark that never goes out. Every storm that drowned a fire left behind something unseen, a residue of determination finer than ash. The rain washed away the flame, but not the will to rekindle it. This was how progress began, not through constant victory, but through the unbearable persistence of failure. The rhythm of burning and extinguishing, of hope and grief, became the pulse of humanity's evolution. Each extinguished hearth was a teacher, and each attempt to relight it, a declaration of faith. Archaeologists today read these stories in layers of earth, bands of char separated by sterile soil, the fingerprints of entire generations striving to hold on to light. It is a story of patience measured in tens of thousands of years. Between each layer lies the silence of rain, the time when fire was gone, when survival reverted to darkness and cold. But between those silences lies something else, the proof that they always returned. To live through that cycle was to live on the edge of the impossible. The humans of the False Dawn and the Age of Ash were no longer mere survivors of instinct. They were students of impermanence. They had learned that mastery was not a single moment of triumph, but the slow accumulation of understanding, that progress could come even through loss, that a life's work might be the tending of something that never truly stays. In this fragile equilibrium, fire became more than a tool. It became a teacher of rhythm. Every rise and fall, every spark and storm traced a kind of heartbeat that mirrored their own. And perhaps that is why, even in the ruins of extinguished hearths, there is evidence of return. They did not move on to easier lands. They came back, they built again, they tried again, because to abandon the fire entirely would have been to abandon the dream of becoming human. The rain was not just the destroyer of flame, it was its sculptor. It forced humanity to learn control through humility, endurance through patience. Every drop that smothered a coal made the next attempt wiser, more deliberate, more sacred. And from that endless repetition, spark, flame, rain, ash, came the slow, luminous realization that control was possible. But that control would not be earned quickly. There were still hundreds of millennia ahead, countless failures yet to come. Still, somewhere deep within the bones of memory, something new had taken hold. They had learned to love the flame, and love, even when unanswered, is persistence. So they carried it forward, through rain, through darkness, through time, until the day would come when the storm no longer ruled them, and the fire, at last, would stay. Something changed. After hundreds of thousands of years of chasing lightning and guarding dying embers, the fire began to stay. Around 300,000 years ago, the world flickered with a new kind of light. Not the wandering glow of a wildfire, but the steady pulse of hearths that burned for days, perhaps even weeks. In the caves of Europe, in the plains of the Levant, blackened stones and layered ash whisper of a revolution too quiet to announce itself. It was not the invention of a new tool, nor the discovery of a new land. It was the birth of endurance. The evidence lies buried in places like Kesem Cave near modern Tel Aviv, where a single hearth shows repeated use over centuries. Layers of ash upon ash, a history of presence, of returning. Nearby, flakes of flint and broken bones tell a story of meals prepared, of warmth sustained, of life unfolding around flame. These were not accidental fires struck once and lost to the rain. They were cared for, fed, remembered. And with that care came something new, responsibility. For the first time, a human might have stayed awake not for hunger or fear, but to guard a coal. The firekeeper was born, an unnamed role, but perhaps the first true profession. While others slept, one stayed to tend the heart of the group. To let the flame die was no longer an inconvenience. It was a failure that could mean death. Every night became a covenant with the light. The act of tending fire reshaped not only how people lived, but how they saw time itself. The burning hearth became a clock, its rhythm slow and steady. Every feeding of the flame was a gesture of continuity, an act that linked the present moment to the past and the future. Fire taught them patience. It taught them cycles. It became a thread binding one night to the next, one generation to another. And around that steady glow, something miraculous began to happen. People stopped wandering. The hearth created gravity. Its warmth drew them in, held them close. The cold darkness beyond the firelight was no longer home. Camps became familiar places, circles of light in a vast wilderness. Here, life began to settle, not fully, not yet, but enough that memory could find a home. This was not just the survival of flame, but the survival of meaning. The world had shifted from the temporary to the enduring. And in that subtle, glowing permanence, humanity discovered something astonishing, that keeping the fire alive was not only a matter of warmth, but of identity. For in that simple act, the tending of a flame, humanity began to recognize itself as a species that could protect, preserve, and remember. The hearth was not a tool like a spear or scraper. It was a centre, a pulse. Around it, life took form. Food was cooked, stories were gestured into being, tools were shaped by steady light. Children learned to crawl toward warmth, to recognize safety by its glow. Even the air smelled different near the fire, thick with smoke, with memory, with belonging. Archaeologists studying the cave layers of Gesher Beno Yaakov and Terra Amata see these first flickers of civilization. There, fire residues appear not as isolated accidents but as continuous presences. In the burned bones, charred seeds and concentric ash rings, we find the first traces of home. Not yet walls, not yet words, but something deeper, an emotional geography. The hearth was the axis around which everything turned. From this stillness, time itself began to expand. For countless generations before, existence had been measured only in movement, following the herds, fleeing the cold, waking and sleeping by the sun. Now, the flame gave a new kind of duration. Nights became longer but gentler. The circle of firelight defined the boundary between danger and calm. Within that border, something like peace could exist. It was here that the first rhythm of human life took shape. Feed the flame, feed each other, rest, repeat. The dance of survival slowed into continuity, and with continuity came reflection. The same flicker that cooked meat also illuminated the faces of those who watched it. They began to see one another not just as bodies, but as beings, luminous for a moment, like sparks in the dark. The presence of fire changed how they saw death too. When someone passed, their absence could be felt most sharply when the fire dimmed. Ash began to resemble something sacred, the physical residue of what once burned bright. In that realization, a connection formed between the living and the lost. The cycle of flame became a symbol for the cycle of life itself. And so, the Flamekeepers' task deepened in meaning. It was not merely about keeping heat alive, but about holding memory. The flame became both a practical necessity and an emotional ritual binding generations through care. Each time the fire was passed from one set of hands to another, it carried more than coals. It carried continuity. For the first time, humanity was not only surviving the night, it was living through it and learning to call the darkness home. Around these enduring flames, something unprecedented unfolded, the invention of night itself. For hundreds of millennia, darkness had been the hour of retreat, of hiding, sleeping, enduring. But now, firelight carved out a second world, one made of reflection, conversation, and imagination. The night ceased to be a void and became a canvas. Under that flickering light, faces glowed and shadows danced across stone. Gestures became language, language became story. It was here, beside the hearth, that culture, in its most ancient sense, was born. Not from a single word or tool, but from the act of gathering around something that united all eyes in the same direction. The flame was not just warmth, it was focus. It gathered attention, wove it into meaning, and from meaning came thought. The first Flamekeepers, then, were not only guardians of heat, they were the first teachers. They controlled not only the body's comfort, but the mind's awakening. Fire structured experience, Its constancy allowed people to plan, to revisit, to imagine. It was the first clock and the first altar, ticking softly in sparks and smoke. Archaeological layers at Kesem Cave reveal this transformation in the very dirt. Over centuries, the same hearth was reignited again and again, its ash carefully brushed aside to make space for new fire. This continuity, generation upon generation returning to the same glowing centre, is the fingerprint of consciousness learning rhythm. The world no longer reset each morning, it accumulated. Memory became landscape. Within that steady light, eyes looked inward. To sit beside a lasting flame was to encounter stillness for the first time, the kind of stillness in which self-awareness grows. It is possible that here, in the hush between flickers, humans first began to dream consciously, to replay hunts, to imagine the dead, to see the world not only as it was, but as it could be. The flame's pulse began to mirror their own. Its rise and fall echoed breath, its crackle mirrored heartbeat. To watch it was to feel a kinship with something living but other, something both fragile and eternal. That recognition, that quiet awe, may have been the birth of reverence itself. From that reverence grew ritual. Fire demanded attention at all hours, creating a rhythm that blurred work and worship. The feeding of the flame became a sacred act, small, repetitive, but profound. To feed the fire was to promise the future warmth. To keep it alive through the night was to affirm that there would be a morning. And so, within the ring of light, a new form of power emerged. Not the strength to kill or flee, but the strength to sustain, the strength to endure together. That was the true invention of fire. Not the spark itself, but the togetherness it demanded. The hearth transformed the structure of survival. It made patience as valuable as muscle, and care as vital as speed. It rewarded those who stayed, who watched, who tended, and in doing so, it reshaped what it meant to be human. In the glow of lasting fire, the boundaries between individuals began to soften. The group became a circle, each person's survival tied to the vigilance of another. The firekeeper could not hunt, but the hunters could not live without the keeper. This delicate web of dependence forged something new: trust. Around the hearth, every task became communal. One fed the flame, another fetched wood, another prepared food. The process of survival became shared ritual, and with ritual came predictability, a rhythm that, for the first time, allowed emotion to rest. Fear no longer had to dominate the night. There was now space for gentleness, for laughter, even for silence without dread. Archaeological evidence hints at this slow blossoming of stability. At sites like Bolomor Cave in Spain, hearths appear in clear, deliberate clusters, spaces where people gathered repeatedly, where the same stones were blackened again and again. The placement of these hearths suggests social structure, a shared centre, a sense of belonging, a place that mattered. For those who lived there, fire was no longer an external force, it was home itself. The light defined the circle of kinship. To sit within its glow was to be known, to be seen. Beyond it lay only the void of wind and predator and ice. It's here that we glimpse the earliest roots of empathy. The sight of another shivering was not just a warning, but a call to action. Feed the fire, share the warmth. Flame became the first equalizer. It gave generously, demanding nothing but care. In its light, the crude distinctions between strength and weakness began to blur. All could gather. All could need. And perhaps it was through this gathering that the emotional palette of humanity deepened. Gratitude, tenderness, loyalty. These may have first taken shape beneath a canopy of smoke and stars. Fire taught not just endurance but affection. The act of sitting close, of breathing together in the flickering light, was an unspoken communion that would echo through all future human rituals. Mealtime, storytelling, mourning, love. The first Flamekeepers may not have spoken words for these things, but they lived them, night after night, as their shadows wove together on stone walls. The fire did not just illuminate the world outside, it revealed the world within, the quiet warmth that begins where fear ends and belonging begins. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity had lived in reaction to the cold, to hunger, to predators, to night. But now, with the fire enduring, a subtle inversion took place. They no longer fled the world, they began to shape it. The Firekeepers' Circle became the first architecture, the first border between chaos and calm. It was the seed from which civilization itself would grow. Archaeological layers from Europe to the Levant tell this same quiet story. The repeating hearths of Beech's Pit, the soot-darkened ceilings of Lazaret Cave, the burnt bones of Terra Amata, all bear witness to this threshold moment. Humanity had crossed from dependency to stewardship. Fire was no longer borrowed, it was kept. The air itself was now marked by human intent, a thin, invisible veil of smoke stretching across time, and from that permanence came continuity. Generations could now return to the same places, to the same fires, year after year. Children were raised not only in the memory of their parents' faces, but in the memory of the same glowing circle of light. The hearth became lineage, a living monument of warmth, rebuilt and relit long after the hands that made it had turned to dust. It was also, in its quiet way, a beginning of time. The rhythm of fire demanded attention. Feed it or lose it. Night after night, its slow pulse taught the pattern of hours and the measure of patience. When it dimmed, they knew dawn was near. When it blazed, they knew evening had settled. Around this flickering centre, the first calendar was written in flame. But even deeper than rhythm was meaning. To sit by the hearth was to witness the paradox of life itself. Matter transformed into light, wood consumed to sustain warmth. It was destruction that nourished. An endless cycle of death turned to comfort. The fire became a teacher of impermanence and renewal, and from that lesson arose the foundations of myth, ritual, and philosophy. The first Flamekeepers might never have spoken these truths aloud, but they lived them with every act of tending. Each time they placed another branch into the coals, they participated in the quiet art of continuation. In the smoke rising upward, they could watch their breath join the sky. And so, in the long winter of deep time, the world no longer belonged solely to the cold. A new centre had been made, fragile, luminous, eternal. And from that centre, humanity's story of memory, meaning, and fire had truly begun. This is not a story of invention. It is a story of devotion. Fire was never discovered in a single flash of genius, never pulled from the heavens by one daring hand. It was not a gift, it was a relationship. It had to be earned through vigilance, through loss, through a kind of faith that only the cold could teach. Humanity did not invent fire. It endured its absence until endurance became understanding. And when, at last, the light stayed, everything changed. The earth around 300,000 years ago was still harsh, unpredictable, and cold. Yet now, something remarkable was taking place in the deep winter of prehistory. The fire no longer vanished with the storm. Across Europe, Asia, and Africa, hearths began to remain. Not the fleeting stains of chance, but deliberate sustained sanctuaries of heat and glow. The ashes of Beech's Pit in Britain, the layered soot of Lazaret Cave in France, the blackened heart of Kiyam in the Levant, all whisper the same quiet truth. Humanity had learned to keep the flame alive. To master fire was to master time itself. For the first time, warmth did not depend on weather, food did not depend on rawness, and night did not mean fear. Meals could be cooked, calories multiplied, parasites destroyed. The long metabolic war against cold began to turn. The human body, which had once shivered its way through endless nights, could now rest. And with rest came something even rarer. The freedom to think, to plan, to dream. Cooking changed everything. Meat that once demanded hours of chewing softened in the flame, releasing more energy with less effort. Roots that had been inedible became nourishment. Fire became a silent partner in digestion, allowing the brain to grow and the body to adapt. The line between necessity and innovation blurred. The act of eating became the act of evolving. Yet perhaps the greater transformation was not physical, but emotional. For the first time, the flame was trusted. The frantic panic that once accompanied every storm began to fade. The fire no longer had to be stolen or begged for. It could be made, rekindled, sustained. What was once a fleeting miracle became a daily devotion. The hearth no longer symbolized survival alone. It became the measure of home, the pulse of continuity. The flame was no longer a guest in the human world. It was a resident, one that asked for care but offered permanence in return. And in that exchange, warmth for attention, stability for reverence, humanity crossed the final threshold. The age of fear had ended. The age of belonging had begun. With the light secured, everything else began to take shape around it. The hearth was no longer just a feature of a campsite. It became the centre of a world. It ordered the hours, defined the limits of a dwelling, and dictated the choreography of daily life. Where fire had once been fleeting, it was now eternal within the scale of a lifetime. Children grew up knowing its warmth as constant. Adults tended it as duty and inheritance. The fire's rhythm became the first heartbeat of culture. From that stability emerged planning, an ability to think not only about what must happen now, but what could happen later. A reliable flame meant a reliable meal, a predictable night, a space in which to store, to make, to imagine. The mind expanded within that stability. The future ceased to be a mystery and became a canvas. Archaeological evidence reflects this transformation. Sites that once bore scattered traces of ash now show deliberate architecture. Hearths circled with stone, arranged in clusters, sometimes even rebuilt in the same places generation after generation. At Beech's Pit and Kessom Cave, stratified ash layers tell a story of long-term continuity, of people returning, maintaining, and protecting the same space over centuries. These were no longer travellers defined by movement, they were caretakers defined by return. The hearth became inheritance. It was tended not for the self, but for others, for those who would sleep beside it tomorrow, for those not yet born. Fire was the first technology that demanded memory. Every hand that fed it was repeating the act of someone long gone, tracing the same gestures through time: lift, feed, stir, breathe. Through that repetition, humanity built its first shared ritual, one that transcended words, that linked the living to their ancestors through light. And as the body grew warmer, the mind grew deeper. The flame's permanence gave rise to reflection. There was now time to sit and think, to look into the fire and see not only the world, but the self. It became the first mirror of consciousness. In its unpredictable motion, in the way it danced, breathed, devoured, early humans saw something alive, something like themselves. The fire's glow softened the edges of existence. Night no longer meant chaos, but calm. Shadows became companions, not threats. Around its perimeter, language could grow, gestures could slow, stories could begin. The flicker of flame on faces gave rise to intimacy, a sense that the world, once indifferent, could now hold warmth and meaning. Fire had not simply made life safer, it had made it thinkable, and in that stillness, that quiet hum of light against the dark, humanity took its first deep breath and truly began to live. Around the hearth, the pulse of existence slowed from mere survival into rhythm, breath, thought, flame, silence. The light no longer signified fear's retreat. It became the place where imagination bloomed. For the first time, the dark beyond the circle of fire was not empty but full of possibility. The shadows on cave walls were no longer just shapes, they were stories. And with those stories, something even greater began to awaken. The idea of meaning. In that amber glow, gestures became narratives. The motion of hands before the flame made figures flicker across rock and hide. The sparks that leapt upward resembled spirits, ancestors, things unseen. The earliest humans, watching this living theatre of light and shadow, began to weave connections between memory and myth, between what they saw and what they felt. Fire was both their stage and their teacher, its shifting brightness guiding their minds toward wonder. Archaeologists studying ancient soot patterns and wall markings believed that early symbolic behaviour, ritualized painting, adornment, storytelling, often unfolded by firelight. The warmth and light made stillness possible, and stillness made imagination inevitable. In the calm between tasks, when the night hummed quietly outside the cave, the mind turned inward. The first dreams may have been kindled in this flicker, not dreams of fear, but of continuity, of belonging. The flame also gave shape to time. Each spark was fleeting, each ember fading into ash, yet each could be reborn with a breath or a twig. To watch fire live and die, again and again, was to see mortality in miniature, and endurance too. This simple rhythm became the first philosophy, that life, like flame, could end and yet continue through care. The fire's immortality depended on attention, and that lesson would echo through millennia of human thought. As mastery deepened, so did the emotional register of human life. Fire provided not only heat and safety, but comfort. Its glow softened grief and illuminated joy. The circle around it became the first sanctuary, a sacred geometry of presence. Here, love began in its most primal form, the act of keeping another warm, to hold a child close to the hearth, to feed the coals for one's kin, to share the light. These were gestures that would one day evolve into tenderness, compassion, faith. The fire was the first inheritance, passed hand to hand, not through words but through care. It united generations who would never meet, connecting the living with the memory of those who came before. And through it all, fire remained both humble and holy. It asked for no worship, only vigilance. Yet, in its endurance, it transformed vigilance into devotion. Because when something can die and yet live again, when something fragile becomes eternal through care, that is not just survival, that is culture. And it was here, in the circle of firelight, that culture began to burn. The hearth became a compass, not of direction but of belonging. Wherever humans went, the same soft orange pulse followed. In the frozen steppe of Eurasia, in the caves of the Levant, in the wind-hollowed basins of Africa, the glow was the same, steady, flickering, patient. To lose the fire was to lose the thread of one's people. To keep it alive was to remain human. Within that shared light, differences blurred. The fire equalized every face. Child and elder, hunter and gatherer, man and woman. It was the first democracy of warmth. Every member of the group could feel it, could contribute to it. The smallest hand adding a stick to the coals played the same role as the strongest hunter guarding the perimeter. Fire created a circle where status dissolved, and cooperation was not strategy, but instinct, a quiet ritual that bound the living together. Anthropologists sometimes call this the hearth effect, the emergence of structured community around a stable source of heat. But in emotional terms, it was more profound. The hearth did not just shape society, it defined it. From this single point of light, new rhythms of life appeared: gathering, resting, cooking, storytelling, repair. The human day extended beyond daylight. Thought stretched into the night, while creativity, once constrained by the sun, began to thrive in the glow of controlled flame. Fire also changed the sound of existence. Before, the world was filled with wind, insects, and the breathing of beasts. Now there was the crackle, a heartbeat externalized. It filled the silence between words, pacing thought. Conversations around a fire were punctuated by its soft murmurs, like an elder whispering approval. In that sound, humanity learned to listen, not just to one another, but to something larger, something eternal. The flame's constancy allowed memory to mature. No longer did stories vanish with the sunrise. They could be repeated, reimagined, retold under the same light that had watched over the night before. Knowledge of hunting grounds, edible roots, migrations, and myths could now persist across seasons. This was how fire gave birth to lineage, to oral tradition, to identity itself. Archaeological traces of repeated hearth use, dark rings of ash layered across millennia, are not just evidence of warmth. They are evidence of return. Each layer is a fingerprint of the same human impulse, to gather, to remember, to continue. Even when the group moved on, the memory of the hearth lingered, an invisible thread that led them back when the seasons changed. The fire's light became the first language that required no translation. Its meaning was universal. Warmth meant life, darkness meant loss. And in that simplicity, in that shared understanding, the species that once huddled in fear beneath a cold and indifferent sky learned something extraordinary. They could make their own sun, and in its glow they learned what it meant to stay. From that moment forward, every spark that burned in the darkness was an echo of that first endurance. Humanity's relationship with the world had changed forever. The Earth was no longer an enemy to survive, but a companion to understand. The cold no longer ruled absolutely. The wind could be met with warmth. The dark could be met with light. With fire, the Ice Age became survivable, but more than that, it became livable. The flame turned existence from reaction into reflection, from instinct into intention. Cooking, crafting, warmth, and rest all flowed from this single act of keeping the light alive. The brain, fed by heat-softened food, grew hungrier for abstraction. The hands, freed from trembling, grew steadier with tools. In the glow of that steadiness, something ineffable stirred. The first human thought not of how to live, but of why. The questions that firelight awakened would burn as endlessly as the coals themselves. Around its steady pulse, humanity learned to linger, to talk, to wonder, to hope. Across continents and centuries, every hearth told the same story. Of patience rewarded, of devotion paid in warmth. The first Flamekeepers were not inventors but guardians. Their genius lay not in spark-making but in continuity, in learning to wait, to tend, to trust that life itself could be sustained through care. They watched for the faintest flicker, shielding it from wind and rain, because they had learned across uncounted generations how fragile existence could be without this fragile sun. That patience, that quiet defiance of extinction, became our first shared virtue. The mastery of fire marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. It was not a single triumph, but a slow unfurling, a dawn stretched over centuries. Humanity stepped out of prehistory not with conquest, but with commitment, a whispered vow to the night that the light would never again be surrendered. The stars above still burned unreachable, but now, below them, a second constellation shimmered. Thousands of tiny fires flickering in unison across the continents. The fire taught continuity. It showed that care could outlast the moment, that endurance could become meaning. When early humans sat beside their hearths and watched the embers pulse like the heart of the world, they were witnessing the first symbol of eternity they could touch. That rhythm, rise, glow, fade, renew, became the blueprint for every story, every ritual, every hope. And when you look into flame today, in a candle's shimmer, a campfire's dance, or the quiet hum of a bulb, you're seeing the same inheritance. Every spark is the memory of someone who refused to let the night win. Because this is not a story of invention. It is a story of faith. The light stayed, and because it stayed, so did we. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for walking this long road through the ice, for standing with those who once shivered beneath the stars and learning how they endured when warmth itself was only a dream. If this story helped you feel a quiet awe for the people who came before us, or a little gratitude for the small lights in your own world, or simply a sense of calm as you drift through the night, thank you for spending your time here. Your listening keeps these ancient fires alive. Perhaps a single image will stay with you, a spark in the wind, a child wrapped in fur, or the glow of a hearth that refused to fade. I wonder which one will follow you into the dark. Whether it was the flicker of the first flame, the soft hum of breath in the cold, or the steady pulse of a fire tended through the centuries, these are the threads that bind our stories across time, fragments of warmth stitched into the vast fabric of human memory. If you'd like, share the image or thought that stayed with you in the comments below, not as noise but as a quiet offering to this small community of late-night wanderers. Each reflection adds another ember to the collective fire we keep. And if you wish to walk further with us, you can like, share, or subscribe. There are more journeys waiting, stories buried in dust, ice, and stars. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,